T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Episode 17 of KUSH'S Korner here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. Tonight we have on Daniel Natusch to talk about his work with scrub pythons in the wild. As many of you who are listening know, scrub pythons are my thing, so to speak, in reptiles. And there are a few people who I would have wanted to speak to more about scrub pythons than Daniel. So I'm very excited about this episode. But before we get into it, as always, USARC. So USARC, as many of you know, is the organization here in the United States that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, and to pursue this means of life. Check out usarc.org for all of the relevant information about USARC and the battles they are fighting for us. And if you are not already a member, I would implore everyone to look into becoming a member of USARC, especially here in the US. We have strength in numbers as a community. So the more people we have behind our causes, the better. And tonight we are brought to you by Juggernaut Reptiles. For anybody who is interested in the blood and short-tail python community, check out Juggernaut Reptiles. They're one of the leaders in that space. They have plenty of other species that they are working with, but that is their main focus. So if you are into the blood pythons and the short-tail pythons, check out Juggernaut Reptiles. We're also brought to you by Blake's Exotic Feeders. If you are here in the United States and are looking for quail to feed your reptiles, check out Blake's Exotic Feeders. They hand raise everything at their facility, so you know you're getting a good product from a good source. Again, check out Blake's Exotic Feeders. And we're also brought to you by Mark Bailey Reptiles. Mark Bailey is one of the OGs in the ball python game. He's been breeding ball pythons at the highest level far longer than I have been alive. For anybody who is into the highest end, most cutting edge designer ball python projects on the market right now, check out Mark Bailey Reptiles. And last but not least, we are brought to you by the Reptile Super Show. So at the end of the month, June 29th and 30th, the Reptile Super Show / LA Pet Fair is going down in Pomona, California. It is one of the largest reptile shows in the country, but also this time it is coupled with the LA Pet Fair. So if you are interested in small mammal pets, aquatics, plants, all of the above. If you are either in Southern California or are willing to travel for an event, check out the Reptile Super Show and the LA Pet Fair. And as always, with this particular Super Show in the summer, MJ is throwing Trap Fest the Thursday beforehand. I am not sure how you get in that exclusive club of being invited to Trap Fest, but if that is something that interests you, I would hit up MJ for the details on Trap Fest. All right, so here we are. I'm very excited for this episode. Obviously all of my work with these snakes has been in captivity, and there isn't a ton of information about wild scrub pythons. There's plenty, especially when you come to the ones in Papua New Guinea. But there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding scrub pythons within the U.S. hobby, and I hope we can clear a lot of this up tonight. Shout out to everybody who is in the live chat already. I've had a lot of people reach out to me today, telling me how excited they are for this episode. So am I. So without further ado, let's get Daniel on the show. How's it going, man?
Hey there, buddy. How are you?
I'm pretty good. So for anyone listening to this episode, maybe later on, who didn't catch it, you were on the All in the Tree Tuesday segment a few weeks ago, primarily discussing green tree pythons. So for anybody who hasn't heard that episode, I would probably say check that out before you check this show out. But for everybody who maybe didn't hear that, what's like kind of a brief little introduction into your life and times in reptiles?
Yeah, to briefly summarize it, I was the kid who always liked reptiles, like most of the people probably listening who now keep snakes and other critters. I somehow managed to turn that into a profession. And now I do a lot of work for the United Nations and the CITES Convention that regulates international trade in wildlife. I don't just work on snakes, I work on a number of species. I also run a charity called People for Wildlife. Check us out on Instagram or Facebook and things like that, working on a range of different issues, some of which are reptilian, primarily crocs, not so much snakes, but doing that too, and then have the hat of being the chair of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN's snake specialist group. So we set the conservation agenda for snakes worldwide, around 3,000 species. And you may know the IUCN Red List, which does the categories of endangerment for different animals around the world. So that's us.
That sounds like quite the full schedule you got there.
Yeah, no, it keeps me off the streets and out of trouble. That's the main thing.
Hey, fair enough. Well, I guess to get into the topic of the show, I mean, did you grow up in Australia? And I remember you saying that you're from New Zealand.
Yeah, from New Zealand, but did a lot of time growing up. Sort of started coming here when I was about 11 years old, primarily to northern Queensland in Cape York. And yeah, that's 6 or 7 different species of python, green pythons, scrub pythons, and then obviously we have in northern Queensland that huge influx of Papuan taxa, so from New Guinea, and so that interest led me to go to New Guinea and study different species there, including scrub pythons, and then came back and did a PhD on a range of different things, but where I radio tracked. I caught about 600 or 700 scrub pythons and marked them and did mark recapture studies, and then put radio transmitters inside 27 of those individuals, which I could follow around through the bush. So learned a thing or two about what they're doing and why, which was fascinating. They're amazing animals.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So how long did it take you to get those numbers of 600 to 700 scrub pythons found?
It was about 3 to 4 years of more or less going out every night.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean,
keeping in mind, that a lot of, once you've tagged 400 of them, you're often going out and seeing the same individuals because they've already been captured.
Right, absolutely. So, I mean, it's safe to say that these populations are pretty well established. There's not much of an issue.
No, zero issue. These things are common as shit. Honestly, they're which is bizarre because within most, certainly with endotherms or warm-blooded animals, the larger taxa, the larger bodied animals are less abundant, but that's sort of flipped on its head a bit when it comes to cold-blooded animals, just because their resource requirements are so much lower. And scrub pythons in Cape York, certainly in my study site, I would argue after the brown tree snake, the boiga animal that's decimated various species on Guam, it's probably the second most abundant snake up there. There's lots of them.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, I feel like most people, if they were just to think about it from a logical standpoint, that probably wouldn't be the conclusion they would come to as far as, you'd say, all right, what's probably the most prolific snake in this area? You wouldn't think, a snake that can be 12 plus feet long. Exactly. Wow. So when was the first time you ever encountered a wild scrub python?
Oh, geez. I remember it. I can still see it curled up in the bough of that tree. Very cliche. I think we pulled up to a campsite. I must have been 11 or 12 or something. It was actually in the Iron Range.
Okay.
Pulled up to a campsite and yeah, I managed to get it out of the tree and then spent the whole night probably very inappropriately fucking around with it, just not letting it go. I was just in awe of how beautiful it was. It was probably a 2.5 to 3 meter animal.
Okay.
And in Cape York, at least, they're very docile. You get the odd nip, but they're pretty docile animals, so that obviously makes them a bit more of a pleasure to work with.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like I've heard that, and scrub pythons have a pretty long standing reputation of being kind of nasty in captivity, or that's at least a lot of people say. But it seems that at least in wild encounters, typically doesn't go that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, the ones down here, I live in Cairns, so in the wet tropics, they are a bit feistier in my experience. Some of the northern New Guinea ones can be quite feisty too. I don't know what that means in terms of their genetic differentiation and so on, but yeah, some like a Biak green python, like they're just nasty little bastards. Where the ones here, I don't think I've ever been bitten by a green python in Australia, and I've caught hundreds of them. And you're not taking them behind the head; you're just holding them like this. Whereas you couldn't say that for a Biak animal.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. So you have found many scrub pythons within Papua, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
What was your first expedition out there to look for? I mean, I assume that green pythons were probably the main target.
I was interested in, because I'd never seen red juveniles in the wild. We only have the yellow juvenile here. Scrub pythons, admittedly, all the way back then, were one of those species that I knew was around, but it wasn't the focus of my interest. And so you'd see them, and sometimes you'll hate me for saying this, but you'll drive along and you'll see one on the road and go, "Oh, cool." And you won't even stop for it. So, but my first expedition to Papua was probably around 07 or late 2000s, before 2010, 07, 08. And that was to Biak only, I believe. And yeah, I think we found one scrub python on that trip and saw a couple of road-killed animals, but it wasn't a scrub python heavy field trip. They're in New Guinea. My experience is they're not quite as common as some of the sites in Australia. They're animals that you see every now and then, unlike green pythons, which you're seeing. If you want to, you can see one every day if you put the effort in. But even with that sort of effort, you're not always finding scrub pythons. Okay.
So out there in New Guinea, typically what's their habitat? I guess it probably will range from north to south, but let's say like Bird's Head Peninsula area. What's typical scrub python habitat?
Well, there is nothing but rainforest, more or less, unless you're in the Transfly area, which is that southern belt around Marorki, which you might be familiar with. It looks like Australia because you've got the eucalypts and the dry, open sort of woodland. Everywhere else in New Guinea, except the very high places where you get stunted vegetation and heath and other things, it's all tropical rainforest. The animals are pretty, well, I rented an apartment for a year or just over a year in Jayapura, and it was more or less in town, a bit of forest around, but pretty urban, and scrub pythons. The neighbor would be like, they've got a snake, and it would be a scrub python. So they're pretty adaptable as well. There is an increasing amount of oil palm going into, especially around Manokwari and places like that. And so I'm not 100% sure whether the scrubbies, I never looked in there and didn't hear any stories. But if it's anything like mainland Asia, where reticulated pythons are super common in oil palm because of all the rats, they're a pretty analogous species. They're quite a similar species to, say, a reticulated python. And so one would suspect they'd be in pretty good numbers in the oil palm plantations as well.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Is there like particular niches that you often see them picking out within the rainforest, or they kind of just, they find where they want to go and they're there, that's where they are?
Yeah, obviously it's been pretty opportunistic, the animals I've found in New Guinea, but if we're going to assume they're doing a sort of similar thing to the rainforest animals I've tracked in Australia, then yeah, they more or less use every bit of the canopy to the ground. There's some broad. I can't remember if I got to publish a lot of this stuff. A lot of it's sitting on hard drives, but from memory, and maybe I did do some analysis, I'm not sure it was statistically significant, but as a general rule, males are larger and heavier bodied, but not as much as people think. Mm-hmm. You do get big girls as well.
Yeah.
And the males do spend more time on the ground than in the trees. And so therefore, and it's because they're bigger, more difficult for a fat dude to lug his carcass up into the top of a tree than it is a skinny dude, right? And so obviously that changes as they age. The older an animal gets, the more time it's spending on the ground. It'll obviously be mediated by predation. The predation risk is higher on the ground, and so once you're at a certain body size, you're less likely to get fucked up by some other critter that's out there. And yeah, that's sort of a general rule. But and they definitely have site fidelity. So that means they know their home range and they come back and use the same places time after time. So they sort of will move around their home range like this, but that's where they'll stay. They're not going to go over here, or some of them had seasonal ranges where they'd spend time here and then they would go over here and they'd do this, but this area and this was an area they didn't really use the intermediate space. And then they'd come back to the same tree hollows time after time, and they knew their habitat, and they would pick out the best places and they'd sit in there regularly. Maybe 10 times a year they'd be in that hollow.
Wow. Did you see a difference in the movement patterns between males and females? Did males do that travel more frequently, or is it pretty even?
Yeah, I think I have published the paper on spatial ecology. I need to go back and read my own papers because I don't think
I up on my phone.
Okay, great. Well, perhaps you know better than I would. I want to say the answer is no. Body size dictated this. And because males were larger in general, but only at those large body sizes, I want to say there was no difference between the sexes.
Okay. Brandon wants to know generally how far between kind of site 1, site 2, like you were showing, what is that distance that they travel?
So their unusual movement pattern, this is all in that paper. Perhaps you could drop it into the chat while I'm rambling at some moment. It's called Spatial Ecology of Scrub Pythons, probably. Yeah. And most movements are basically sit here, and then it becomes nighttime, move 5 meters over here, set up ambush and sit there. And then maybe when it gets to dusk, they'll move into a tree over here 30 meters away. So very small movements, and that might happen for a week. And then suddenly they might do one movement in a night that's 300 meters.
Okay.
And then they repeat that pattern of relatively small movements, not doing a hell of a lot. Not all of them made those large distance movements. It was a bit weird. I had some animals that spent most of their time in rainforest, but then after the fires had gone through, they would move out into the woodland and not sort of use an intermediate area. And that was, we're talking less than a mile,
Okay.
Maybe it may be a mile for some of the big ones.
Okay, interesting. Did you have any theories as to why they would make those kind of mini migrations?
I think it was related to prey. When these animals are large, they preferentially eat larger prey. Mm-hmm. So if you're a hulking 3.5 meter scrub python, you will still eat rats and things like that, but your preference is bandicoots, it's wallabies, it's big animals. Yeah. And those animals are typically woodland animals rather than rainforest animals. And so I think when it was safe, Fire. I had some animals killed by fire. Fire is a pretty common thing in the woodland landscapes in this part of the world. And so once they've sort of figured out whether it's safe or not, they head out into the woodland, where I think they're encountering those larger bodied prey with greater regularity, or at least they would, or they would often hunt on the edge of the rainforest, so where the border between rainforest and woodland, rather than just sitting in the. But then again, every animal, if you live in Manhattan, then you learn to adapt to the Manhattan way of life. If you live in upstate New York in Ithaca or something, then you're gonna adapt to that sort of lifestyle, and they're slightly different, even though you're the same species, and you might be brother or sister or whatever with the other person in the other place. But so the point being, there were some that did live in the thick rainforest and never left and didn't make these long movements. They just lived in rainforest their entire lives. Spent more time in the trees, probably found a different hunting strategy, probably ate more birds. Yeah,
that was going to be my next question, is how often are you seeing these animals consume birds in the wild?
With much greater regularity than green pythons. Everyone thinks, green pythons are arboreal and they must be camouflaged that way to be hunting birds in the canopy. If you listen to the last talk, you find buggerall birds in green pythons. Scrub pythons you do find a lot more. In certainly the smaller animals, I think, are taking more birds. So they'll also actively search, and they'll eat eggs out of nests.
Interesting.
They'll just come through the trees, and if they find something, the bigger animals, fewer, as I said, they like larger prey. And so we have a thing called a bush turkey here. It's a pretty common bird. It's about the same size as the turkeys you get in the US, perhaps a bit smaller. And they will, from time to time, the larger animals eat those. But as they grow, they are going after mammals more and more because and we see. So I also studied metallic starling colonies. It's a species of bird that migrates over from New Guinea and nests in these massive colony trees, and there's thousands of birds, and they drop all this guano and seed, and so you get all these animals coming in. And scrub pythons were, you might find 5 or 6 scrub pythons under each tree every single night, and they just cruise around, and they're eating the baby birds. But there was definitely, again, I need to publish it, but there was definitely, and it is significant, the animals that used the trees were on average smaller than the animals in the broader landscape, because again, you'd turn up and a scrub python might have 5 or 6 or 7 bulges of baby birds inside it, and that's fine for them. Whereas for a big animal, they're just not wasting their time on a little thing the size of a starling,
Sure. Do you think that prey selection is more just based on availability, or is that potentially just their preference at a certain size? Like, would they eat the appropriate size rat before they would try to raid the nests if they had the option?
Yeah, I think in terms of prey preference, I think it is availability. These animals, so I radio tracked a number that were tree users, and then a number that were just out in the random landscape. And what we saw was, because the birds are only there for a certain time, so in the random landscape, the animals are doing this. So on my screen, if you can see me, they're doing this throughout their range, just sort of random movements in their range. And the birds come, and those animals in the broader landscape keep doing this. For the animals that use the trees, when the birds were not there, they would also be doing this, just randomly going around their landscape, whatever. And then the birds arrive, and all of those animals that know about the birds, or at least, I don't know whether they know or whether they just happen to have a colony within their existing home range.
Sure.
But these colonies stink. And so the snakes can come in from kilometers away. And then when the birds are there, they just go.
Wow.
and they just sit underneath the trees every single night. You'll turn up and it's like, hey, Billy the scrub python. Oh, there's Susie the scrub python. It's the same individuals. You pick them up and it's like, oh, yep, that's you. Eventually, every now and then you get the odd new one, but those animals will eat birds that have fallen down every night, and then they'll go and sit 5 meters away underneath a log or something during the day, and then the next night they're back at the tree, and that's their life.
Wow. That's incredible. And like, what's the size of the animal, age of the animal that is doing this?
These, I could tell you exactly, but there's not many animals over 2.4 meters snout to vent length. Because tails get cut often in the wild,
sure,
we don't measure in total length. So, an animal of 2.4 meters, you're adding about 36 to 40 centimeters of tail. So you're looking at a 2.7 meter animal is definitely on the larger size. Most of them are probably around the 2.1, 2.2.
Okay.
1.7, that sort of size.
So probably, sorry.
Pardon me. No, pardon me. You go.
So I was going to say probably animals that are in like the 3 to 7 year old range, more than likely.
2 to 3. 2 to 3, and then some of the outliers. Yeah, these things grow pretty rapidly.
Okay.
I do have some data on that, on growth rates in the wild, and you do get the ones that just don't grow very much. Before, as you and I were chatting about before everyone jumped on the call, food input dictates growth, as you all know. You will know this better than I do, I'm sure. And
we're Americans, we know.
Let's not go there. Those animals that don't get a lot of food just aren't growing, and so sure, some of them might be 5 years old, but the vast majority, that they're reaching sexual maturity in 2 to 3 years in the wild.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay,
so let's talk about this for a bit, because this is definitely a topic of great contention within the U.S. hobby. Of people saying if your scrub python reaches what you would probably consider an adult size before 6 or 7 years, you've abusively power fed said animal. That's why I gave that range. So yeah, what generally speaking, what are you seeing as this the growth rate?
Like I said, so they reach maturity at about somewhere in that 1 point. This is females. Males are less interesting. Obviously, we always are. The females are the key sex in terms of population persistence and things we'd be interested in. Males can reach maturity around 1.6 at least, 1.6 meters, which isn't very long. That's a pretty small animal.
That makes sense to me, at least.
Females need to be larger. That's sort of the 1.9 to the 2.2 meter mark. And there's some animals will get to that in a very fast one. So no animal's getting to that within a year. If you power fed it in captivity, it probably could. But in 2 years, I'd say the average is 3, maybe heading towards 4. And these animals, to your point, are much smaller in terms of girth, not so much in length, but in terms of girth than you would expect as breeders. Just like the green python thing, where everyone used to say they need to be over 1,000 grams or whatever. It's like, no, they're breeding at 400 grams. And so like I had permits and everything, so I just, or road kills, I'd be killing these animals, knocking them on the head and cutting them open so I can see exactly what was happening. And so you have a size series, or you use museum specimens, and the vas deferens that we have, we've got epididymal tubes in our testicles that convolute when in the presence of sperm. So they sort of do this, and it's really obvious. If one of your animals dies, it's a male, open it up, and running through the kidneys, you'll see the kidneys look a bit like a kidney, right? And running through the middle of that, you'll have the vas deferens. And if you look really closely, you'll see that it's not clear, it's really, if they're mature, they're really thick, and inside are just heaps of tightly bound, sort of like a roller coaster, squiggles like this. And that means that your male is sexually mature, and there's the presence of sperm in that organ.
Wow.
With females, it can be a bit more tricky because the reproductive mucosa or the reproductive organs in these animals, because they're such extremophiles, let's say, they have the ability to upregulate all of that during times of reproduction, as in get a big ovary, get big, thick oviducts and all of that. But then they can shrink it all back down during periods when they're not using it, just like Stephen Secor and these guys have shown that pythons can do with their gastric mucosa, their gastric organs, their stomach and things like that. When they're not using it, they just go, well, I'm not going to put energy into a bunch of tissue and organs that I don't need right now, so I'm just going to shut it down and just put my energy into the things that keep me alive. And that's also true for reproductive organs. The reason why I'm nerding out right now is because if you're not in a reproductive stage as a female and you reduce all the size of your organs, us as scientists or you guys cutting them open might be like, now definitely a virgin. It's never reproduced because there's no large ovary, like thick muscular ovary. There's no oviduct that's thick and muscular. But what happens when so follicles sit in the ovary and then the follicles burst and the ovum migrates into the oviduct and becomes an egg, right? Yeah. That's how it works in these species. And when the oviduct bursts, that ovum comes out, and the bursting of the follicle actually leaves a scar, which at first is quite large. It's called corpora albicantia. And then, it's called corpora lutea. And then over time, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. Sort of the scars heal, just like our scars. If we get a cut, we heal. And then you're left with a very, very small black dot, which is called corpora albicantia. And that you can basically, if you know what you're looking for, open up a female and she might look like a virgin, but she has these signs that she's actually reproduced. And you can determine in which season, based on the size of these scars, you can actually see a time series that says she reproduced in 2007, 2008, she skipped 2009, and she reproduced in 2010. So you can see all that inside the animal.
That's fascinating.
And it's going to tell you that animal's not a virgin. So after all that garbled bullshit I just said,
that was great.
The point of that is that in the wild, if an animal is killed or whatever, and a lot of animals just die, and so you pick them up and you take whatever information you can, and so you cut them open and you can see that, that's a really small animal, but I can see that the previous season, when she was probably even smaller, she had a clutch of eggs. So that's how we can tell.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess based on that research you've done, what would you say, either based on what you would think would be a current reproductive episode or a past, would be like the smallest female that you have done research on, where you're like, okay, this animal probably reproduced 2 years ago and she was probably this size?
Yeah, no, it's in the, I do have the exact figure, I just don't remember. It's in the high 1 meters. It's like 1.9 meters snout dimension.
Wow.
But again, add 30 centimeters for a tail. You're talking about a 2.4 meter animal total.
Still, that's very small by what captive standards would tell you.
Yeah, I mean, this means nothing to you, does it? She's that big. She's this big. You get what I mean? Like,
yeah.
If you put for someone my size, a dude like me, if you put your fingers touching your middle finger touching your thumb, she's not a lot bigger than that, you know?
Wow. And what age roughly do you think that snake would be?
I'd hazard a guess. You know, there's no point providing outliers. You might get some that are two years old or 2.5 years old, depending on when the season falls.
Sure.
But that's super rapid. That's an animal getting lots of food, doing really well. That's an outlier. I'd say the vast majority, it's 3 to 4 years.
Okay. Wow. That's.
But then again, but it's the same in the same way. You're going to get some that, and this is true, and we see it with reticulated pythons, because I've dissected about 15,000 reticulated pythons over the last however many years, and some of them will be clearly 8 years old, and they've never had a reproductive event. And so that's between males and females. It's challenging because you're not necessarily looking at physiological maturity, i.e., is the animal mature? What you're actually looking at is, has it reproduced before? And in females, there's no way to really tell if something is physiologically mature. Something may be mature and absolutely capable of reproducing. It just hasn't, just never got around to it, or avoided all the boys or whatever. Whereas in males, because of the morphological difference in the vas deferens, you can actually determine physiological maturity, but you can't determine the other, which is, has this boy ever actually had a girl?
Sure.
Still with me?
Yeah. That's insane. I want to keep going on this topic, but we have a lot of questions in the chat that I do want to hit for these guys. So just on this topic of that animal you were describing, what type of scrub, or what was the area you found this animal in? This small female had that reproduction?
All from the tip of Cape York. So amethystina type animal, or a very northerly king horn-eye, depending on which books you read. Yeah.
All right. Another question from a little bit earlier. Brandon wants to know, are they eating bats?
That's a great question, Brandon, and I don't know. They're definitely eating like flying foxes, so the big macro bats. If you I don't know, get them in Florida, or so the big fruit bats. Yes. Whether they're eating micro bats, I'd say the answer is still probably yes. I don't think I've ever recorded it, though.
Okay.
And I don't think it's a prey item that they're eating with great regularity.
Okay. More just if they can, they will kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, they'll eat anything,
For sure. All right. And then Patrick wants to know what neonate prey preference seems to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in green pythons, as I've said, it is small lizards and skinks, whereas I don't want to lie to people. I want to say I've never pulled a lizard out of a small scrubby. They've always, because what I'll do is, scientists are bastards. I'll come across a snake with a big bulge in its stomach, and I'll be like, I don't care, mate. I want to see what that is, and so I'll palpate it to regurgitate that animal, and so I can tell 100%. Oh, yep, that's just a fucking house mouse or whatever it is. Hashtag science, yes. And so I want to say that everything I've pulled out of small scrubbies has been mammals and birds.
Okay.
Primarily mammals.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just big enough when they're young. They've got a pretty big head, and I think they, some pythons, even though they have, the mental groove and they can dislocate the jaw and do all that, they don't tend to take huge prey items. Whereas scrubbies, I think, are one of those species that may have some morphological differences that I don't know about. And so this is speculation. I don't know this for those listening, but just from spending a shitload of time with lots of different animals and watching what they do, scrubbies definitely take massive prey items. And so that ability for the adults to do that is probably there in the juveniles. And so they can stretch their skin in a way. I mean, they're incredible, like, more than 100% of their body weight they're eating in wallabies. And often, to be honest, they're of the 27 scrub pythons I caught and radio tracked, a good number died. Two got burned up in fire. Couple got beaten up by their prey items and died. And then about 7 or 8 of them died because they tried to eat wallabies that were too big for them.
Whoa.
And wallaby killed them. So the wallaby's dead. So they've managed to kill and overcome the wallaby, but then when they've gone to eat it, it's killed them. But it's weird. I don't know why, because I had one where the wallaby's, what are they called, foot and claw came right out the side through the ribs, punctured the skin, and was just sitting on the outside of the animal. And that animal just slowly, just sat in the sun and pulled it back in, and then the scar healed up, and then it just went on its way, and it was fine. And yet others, there was no visible damage, because I had to obviously dissect them, and there was no visible damage, and they just die. A couple of other times, those radio-tracked animals, I'd come across them, and it would be like, oh, that's just eating a massive wallaby. That's, massive bulge. It's sitting out there. And then you'd get, say, the weather would change. You'd get a few days of rain where it's not that hot. There's not that much sun. And I'd go back there 2 days later, and the animal would be there with the wallaby in its stomach, but it's covered in maggots. The outside of this animal's skin is covered in maggots. So, it does smell. So what I think is happening is the flies, it basically is this: the snake hasn't got enough solar radiation, or it hasn't got hot enough to properly digest that huge prey item. So the prey item has started to rot, to decompose, rather than be digested. It's decomposing inside the stomach. The flies can smell that, and so the flies go, and they can't find the rotting meat anywhere. They just go to the closest thing, and there's just this much skin between the rotting meat and the outside where the flies are. So the flies lay all their eggs on top of the snake, and the snake gets covered in maggots, and then eventually those animals regurgitate the wallaby and just go on and keep living. So that may be why some of them are dying. I never actually, none of the ones that died ever had the maggot thing. But anyway, that's the point being, scrubbies like to eat big prey.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. Have you been able to gather data to say, like, that there's a growth pattern difference between animals who seem to be eating these larger prey items, or, like, let's say the ones that were raiding the bird nest for these tiny baby birds?
That's a great question. I would, the data are sitting there. I just haven't analyzed them. I will be able to say something, i.e. yes or no, whether the animals that are using the starling colonies versus those animals that are not, whether there's differences in growth rate there.
Okay.
But I haven't done the analysis yet. But otherwise, in the broader landscape, I wouldn't be able to say, because even though I'm radio tracking and I'm able to see them regularly, some of them I would only track once a week. And so it's possible that they did eat. And there's, so to that point, there is probably an observer bias there, because when I come across them, if they've eaten a big animal, then it's still going to be visible in their stomach. The bulge is still going to be visible, right?
Yep.
Whereas if they've eaten a rat, or if it's a big snake, they've eaten a bandicoot or something, it's not even going to show a bulge. So I could turn up the day after they've eaten it and not see it. So to that point, and everything I've just said, I could be full of shit. Maybe scrub pythons don't preferentially eat larger animals. They actually eat more regularly, and I just don't see them eating the small animals because I'm not there in the moment they're capturing it. I'm just, a lot of this, I'm going off what I see inside the bulge of the snake.
Sure. Okay. That kind of eliminates my next question of for these animals that are eating these large items, what kind of general frequency are you seeing with those meals? But then I guess then that brings into the account the meals that you missed with potential smaller prey.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to that point, I don't think there's a massive bias, because these things are not eating that regularly,
Sure.
And you can also tell from their behavior, like if they're out in ambush hunting, that whereas if they're spending multiple days coiled up somewhere, then there's a greater chance that they're not that hungry, right? So you can use behavioral cues to determine frequency of food consumption. But yeah, it's one thing is, in this country, people say that their animals stop eating. There's people that keep, scrub pythons in aviaries and cairns, or even in Brisbane, so outdoor enclosures, and they'll say our scrub pythons stop 100%, always stop eating during the winter, the dry season. And they were quite amazed when I said, no, the animals in the wild just keep eating whenever they can. So they'll eat through the cold periods, even if they're reproductive and breeding. There's males that are out looking for girls, and I come across them in mating aggregations, and then those males will get a wallaby the next day. And admittedly, sometimes I'd also fuck with them, where I'd be coming back from doing whatever, and the wallaby would jump out, and I'd hit it and kill it. and then I'd get the radio tracking gear. I'd be like, oh, I'm close to. I named all the snakes after Lord of the Rings characters because I'm super cool. And so I'd be like, oh, Aragorn is around here somewhere. So I'll get the gear and I'll go out and I'll find him, and I'll just put the wallaby out the front of the log that he's sitting in. And then I might set up a camera trap or something, or just sit down and have a beer or a cup of tea if I've got one in the truck. And yeah, they just crawl out of the hole and just eat the roadkill wallaby that I'd left there.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, that I feel like that the way that you said people are saying that their snakes are not eating during the winter, same thing over here. But just me not having really knowledge of the ecology of these places, just based on their proximity to the equator and the climate, it didn't make any sense to me that these animals would have like large seasonal times of not consuming food.
Well, exactly. It's definitely cooler, but as long as the sun is shining, the sun's, even in the winter up there, the sun's hot.
Yeah.
You and I wouldn't be sunbathing even in the coolest winter day, because you'll be burned in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So winter is not, it's not Wisconsin.
Thank God. Another chat question. Lisa wants to know if males go through spermatogenesis more than once a year.
Great question. No, I think it's an annual seasonal thing.
Okay.
I have no evidence to suggest otherwise, and all the evidence suggests that it's once a year for both boys and girls.
Okay. And what time?
And to be honest, most girls, they're not breeding every year. Most of them are every second, sometimes every third year. Okay. Now, of the 27, I can't remember, of those 27 animals I radio tracked, most of them were females. I think a good, maybe only 10 were males. That would make 17 females. And of those 17 females tracked over 2 to 3 years, only 3 of them reproduced in that whole period, which says to me that they are reproducing quite infrequently.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that does kind of track with what we are seeing over here in the States. There've been a handful of people who've gotten successful consecutive clutches out of the same female. I have yet to experience that, but based on kind of what we've all seen over here, and then what you're saying, that definitely makes a lot of sense to me that they're not consecutively breeding. Brandon wants to know the time of year for when these females are laying eggs. Is it consistent typically with some seasonal cycle?
Yeah, it's very, very consistent. More or less same times of year. They are. You're catching me out. I should read my own papers more regularly. They're breeding in that June, July, August period. That's when you see them wrapped up together, and then the eggs kind of go down in September, October, and hatching is December, January.
Okay, so seasonally for us on the opposite end of the of the world, would that be like, what season are they beginning that process?
So that is if you're sitting there and you're thinking about the reality of what's happening. So in your summer, they're breeding.
Yeah.
And
so that's your winter, correct?
Exactly. In our winter.
Yeah.
So I guess if you're to flip it, assuming they're using the same cues, you're getting your animals to breed, to lock up in December, January, and then they are laying eggs in sort of March, April for a mid-year summer hatching date.
Yeah. Okay. That tracks perfectly with what I see, at least, and a lot with other people are seeing. That definitely makes sense.
One point there is, I don't have any of these answers for northern New Guinea. For southern New Guinea, I do. Okay. It's the same as Australia. But let's take Wagio or Biak or places like that, which are pretty much on the equator.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. I didn't see enough scrub python. I just didn't do any long-term field studies. I just find animals and then look at them for a bit and then release them. So I never had any of that deep ecological knowledge in northern New Guinea.
Okay.
So maybe it's flipped. Maybe they're aseasonal. They just kind of go whenever. I suspect that's not true. I think they will, even in those equatorial areas, and we see the same with reticulated pythons and blood pythons, basically all sorts of snakes with much larger sample sizes. It's pretty seasonal. Yeah, but it does switch in the equator. Like our reticulated pythons have lots of eggs in them in southern Sumatra around September, October period, and then you go sort of 2 degrees north of the equator into North Sumatra, so still on the same island, same species. It's flipped, and the eggs are there in March, April.
Okay. Huh. Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. Just that very slight difference in separation from the equator creates that much of a difference.
Either side of the equator, yeah. And it's interesting because the monsoon, so it's not tied to rain. It is really tied to that season because the monsoon is the same time everywhere. The wet season.
Okay.
So you've got one that's breeding and laying eggs in the dry season, even though it's equatorial. There's only a slight difference, and then one that's laying eggs they're all laying in one season, like dry season or wet season, but some of them are laying in the hot time and others are laying in the cold time.
Wow. That's super fascinating. Back on the feeding topic, Brandon wants to know if you've ever had one who's eaten a cassowary.
I definitely never have. I don't think it's ever been recorded. It's not implausible. Cassowary is a big bird. Even the recently hatched ones are pretty big little birds.
Sure.
And the parents are nasty. Mum is the dad looks after them, but mum at least is a feisty motherfucker. And so, I think they're pretty well protected, and I'm sure it's happened. We've had them eating tree kangaroos.
Okay.
They've definitely been recorded eating tree kangaroos. I had them eat quite a lot of couscous, things like that. But I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like if I was a scrub python, a cassowary would be like very much on the bottom of my list of prey that I would go after. It'd be a last resort if I was a scrub python. All right, so Timothy is asking about scrub pythons and mating groups, and I think probably this is coming from some of the recent revelations here in the U.S. hobby with Boelen's pythons, where a lot of people who are, or I guess not a lot, the few people who are now being routinely successful with Boelen's here in the States are having their success by using multiple males over a female simultaneously, where they'll have 2 or 3 males in with the female. Have you seen this behavior with scrub pythons?
Yes, I've seen them. Most of it is individual, like one to one that I've witnessed. I've seen once in my own study 2 males with a female.
Okay.
And that, these are things where I've, and it's quite cool. You'll go to track, let's say Boromir, and he'll be wrapped up with Arwen, and then you'll find another male there with them. But that's only happened once.
Okay.
I know that down here with the king horneye around the wet tropics where I am around Cairns, it's more common to find aggregations in the winter time in some of the gorges.
Okay.
Big, river systems and the rocks there. But yeah, so I think it is happening, but it's definitely not. It's not like they have to have multiple males in order to get the girl going or anything like that. They're definitely doing a lot of one-on-one. Although I suspect that she is mating with multiple males, and that there may be multiple fathers in a single clutch of eggs.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And then how about competition, violence, any sort of combat behavior between males? Have you seen any of that?
I've seen bite marks that are consistent with males biting each other.
Okay.
In my study site, though, I'm lying to you. Yeah, I've seen it. Oh, no. Yeah, no, I've definitely seen males fighting. But I've weirdly seen males fighting. I saw 2 males fighting, and then once they'd finished, they went and sat up in the rafters, like right next to each other in a small shack on the beach. I have seen them fighting, but my general impression is that they're not quite as nasty as some of the other ones. They're fairly tolerant of one another. I don't think I've ever seen them biting each other.
Okay.
I've seen bite, the big, the jaw mark on the animal, which is consistent with that. And I know there are photographs of down south where animals get really cut up, like really slashed, bad wounds from bites from other males.
Sure.
I haven't seen that in a big way in the populations that I've studied intensively.
Okay. Interesting.
And you don't see males, fighting, they're wrapped up together fighting with great regularity. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because anecdotally, I've only heard of one instance of any sort of like major issue with multiple males, where a friend of mine had 2 Clastolepis that was sold as a pair, ended up being 2 males, and upon breeding introductions, one killed the other instantly. Well, it didn't. So it bit the other, and then that snake succumbed to its wounds within the next couple of weeks. I personally have accidentally had 2 males or 2 females together a few different times, and nothing has ever happened. And it took me way too long to realize I didn't, in fact, have a male and female pair. So interesting to hear. So kind of going back now to general what you've seen out in the wild. Where all have you encountered scrub pythons in New Guinea and surrounding islands?
All right, starting in the west coast, Wagio,
okay,
Missoul. I don't think I ever saw one on Kofiau.
Okay.
I don't think I saw one on Salawati or Batanta.
Okay.
Sarong, Manokwari, Temambua. I'm just going to say a bunch of names. So
yeah,
random places between Manokwari and Sarong on the Birds Peninsula.
Yeah.
Aru. I've seen some on Saram, the other Tanimbar, but let's not talk about those for now. Biak, Jayapura, and then just random, on the road to Lere and stuff, so out in the north. Seen them in Papua New Guinea over the other side along the north there, and then I've seen a bunch around Tanamera, Mindiptana, Waropko area, and then quite a few down in the Merauke area.
Okay.
And I think that's it. I never saw any in the Wamena area, Nabera. Yeah, I think it's basically it. Never saw one on Yuapen.
Okay.
Yeah, num 4 never saw one. So yeah.
Okay. So a million questions already just based on that list alone. But let's start with the Bird's Head Peninsula animals. There has been for years lots of debate within the U.S. hobby about how we define our different localities within what we would call barneck scrub python. Are you seeing in animals from mainland Bird's Head Peninsula like this phenotype I can directly associate with this location or that location, or are you seeing a mixture of phenotypes throughout the ranges?
Yeah, to start with the first question last, there's definitely within a single locality quite a bit of phenotypic variation. Okay. Not like where you just get everything, but it almost seems like there are two. Let's use an easy dumbass example. In southern New Guinea, you get the thing that looks just like animals from northern Australia. Your classic Marorki amethystina, and then that night. I said there was, was I talking to you before or after? So I found that massive animal in southern New Guinea. I said it was about 5.5 meters that I was actually quite scared to catch because I was like, fuck, I'm all alone. I was actually stuck in the mud on the road that day. And so I couldn't get out. And so that night I was like, I was sleeping in the car, getting bitten by mosquitoes. And I was like, fuck, I'm just going to go for a walk. And that's when I found it. And in that same, I think we spent a whole day stuck in the mud. And so the next night I found another animal, and it was the patternless scrub python.
Okay.
Right? No pattern whatsoever.
Yeah.
And they were 10 meters. Well, fuck, I'm lying to you. They were 100 meters, 50 to 100 meters apart from where I locate.
Yeah.
And so, they are occurring together. I don't know the genetics or anything behind it, or whether there's any differentiation, whether they're two taxa. I understand from the hobby that they're just different morphs of the same thing.
Sure.
But in the same way, and the point being, you don't seem to get slightly patterned or slightly less patterned. You don't have all that. You've got a non-patterned one and a patterned one, but you don't have all the variation in between.
Okay.
And so for places like Sarong, also true for Jayapura, Manokwari, they're both definitely barnecks, but one broad type here to me, and I was going to say I can't claim to be an expert. Perhaps I know more than most, but I haven't seen that. It's not like I'm nowhere near as confident as with green pythons.
Sure.
But on this side, you have an animal that is a barneck, but kind of has a bit of an amethystina, southern New Guinea or northern Australia type pattern.
Sure.
And then you have an animal that is much lighter, and you'll know what you've all seen them. And there's relatively little pattern. There's still pattern, but they're a much lighter, brighter animal, or almost a creamy colored thing. And they're the more beautiful one, right? Yeah. And so you sort of have those two broad phenotypes, it seems, across that northern range.
Sure.
And little bits of variation in between, but no like big sort of an integrate of encompassing all the iterations of variation to get from this point to that point.
Sure.
If you had photos of them, I could be like, that, and
also, I'm actually, as we're talking, I'm like, I feel like I should try to get some pictures in here to see what if there's we can be on the exact same page. Let's see. This makes for wonderful audio. All right, here we go. All right.
While you're doing that, it's also you get to see a lot from those areas because traders are bringing them in, or you'll go to some guy's house. He's got a couple sitting in bags there, and so you get to see that variation. But just some of the scrubs from them, let's call them the ugly one. They're quite.
Is this what you call the ugly one?
more so. Yes.
Okay. So this is what the U.S. hobby would refer to as a Wamena scrub, which, as time goes on, we believe, and you'll probably know the best, are probably more along the lines of Jayapura and then east into PNG. Does that track what you've seen?
Those and like that's what they look like on Wagyu, Biak. Like that's just a northern animal. That's one version of the northern animal.
Sure.
I don't think that's a Wamena. I wouldn't even call it Jayapura. Obviously, there'll be a slight difference, and I can't go into sort of detail like I could with green pythons. But I've seen animals more or less like that in Sarong, Manokwari, Wagyu, Biak, Jayapura.
Wow.
And then I've also seen the other thing that hopefully you're bringing up now, which is it's not too dissimilar. It's just the lighter, the much.
Well, then there's this, which is kind of a line bred example of what you'd probably think would be like the darkest individuals from maybe like Sarong or so, or.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I never saw an animal that dark though.
Sure. Yeah. And this is the product of captivity. But just from the pattern, more or less standpoint.
Yeah, sort of. I guess so. My memory's faded, but I've got lots of photos sitting on hard drives. But yeah,
sure.
I mean, if you got that, but with a lighter, less black, then that's more or less, I guess, what I'm talking about.
And I'm very hopeful that I almost have that here for you.
And some of them have much less pattern, or the bulk of the pattern is sort of on the tail, and as you get towards the head, there's much less pattern. Okay. Still there, it's just not as contrasted. The blacks and the whites, say, aren't as contrasted. You get more just sort of white, and then the black patterning sort of fades into just a slightly darker beige, if that makes sense.
Sure. So I guess it's probably safe to say you couldn't necessarily associate a particular phenotype with a locality label, correct?
I couldn't. It's possible you can. I would not feel confident if you showed me that first animal, that first photograph you put up, I'd be like, yeah. I'd be like, yeah, I know it's not from southern New Guinea, but I can't tell you anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
If you went, it's a sarong, and I would go, oh, cool, and it was actually a Jayapura, then you'd definitely trick me. I would
for sure. So this is kind of
exactly what I mean.
Yeah,
exactly right. See, it's got a bit more dark towards the tail, but a lot lighter towards the head. But the bar neck really stands out. And for me, those are stunning. I love that phenotype.
Me too. And so whereabout, again, where are you finding the animals that have this phenotype?
Everywhere across the north.
Everywhere across the north, even into Jayapura?
The one I said I pulled out of the lady's apartment next to the apartment that I was renting was that animal.
Wow.
And I've got photos of that.
This sends everything that we thought we understood about scrub pythons completely out the door. So for your reference, based on the U.S. hobby, this animal, if it was on an import list, would be labeled a Manokwari, and there would be you need riot teams to stop people who were if you tried to claim otherwise, you would cause riots. This animal would be labeled as a sarong locality type.
I've definitely also seen Manokwari. I've never seen an animal like that in Manokwari, I don't think, but I've definitely seen that lighter version that I just said was beautiful. I've seen that in sarong as well. Yeah, that they're in sarong for sure, as are the ugly ones.
Okay. And then this animal that we've now looked at a couple of times, that would be called a Wamena, and then secondarily called a Jayapura, because now we don't think that the hobby doesn't think that there are in fact Wamena scrub pythons. You said you have not found a scrub python in Wamena, correct?
I did
Or around
not,
Wamena.
because I never saw any traders in Wamena, and so the reason I went was for bolins. I did a bit of scouting for green pythons. I don't think they're there, and everyone you speak to is like, no, they're not in Wamena.
Okay.
I think someone else, Carabaga, Bokondini, those sort of areas. Yeah, so scrub pythons could be there, but it's like a big, they could be there. They're at high elevations elsewhere. It's just they're not in the valley itself. They could be on the periphery in the forested areas.
Sure, because that was going to be my next question was, is there a point in elevation where you're like, all right, we're at hypothetically 5,000 feet. When we go above, there's virtually no chance of seeing scrub pythons. Is there that cutoff in elevation?
There absolutely will be. I just don't know what it is. Sorry.
Sure, no, for sure. I mean, if you had like a rough estimation, or do you not even want to?
No, I would be doing you a disservice if I tried to guess, because then people would say Dan Natusch said this. Yeah, green pythons, you find them at 2,000 meters around Nondagal and in PNG. And scrub pythons could be there too. I just don't know. 2,000 meters is pretty damn high. That's 6,000 feet.
Yeah, for sure.
But it could also be lower.
Yeah, no, I get that for sure. So then,
put it this way: they're definitely in sympatry with bolins. So bolins, you get down to 1,000 meters, and you get scrub pythons definitely up to 1,200 meters. So you can find them side by side theoretically.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think I've ever heard that one before. That's fascinating.
I've never done it. I've never found them at the same site,
Sure.
But yeah.
But where about would you find that potentially?
Around the Timika area, around the Grasberg, the Freeport McMurrin mine.
Okay.
They found them down to the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Those Alan Allison and those guys have found them down around 1,000 meters, because obviously the mine pays for ecological impact assessments and all that sort of thing. They've found them down to, and we're looking at doing as the snake specialist group of IUCN, looking at doing a project with the Indonesian government. If Ari Flagel and people are listening and anyone wants to give money to support an Indonesian student to go and do research on bolins, either with IUCN, then let's start a crowdfund or some shit. But so that's the problem for now is we don't know, but they've been found at 1,000 meters there, and definitely the habitat is fine for scrub pythons. There's no reason why scrub pythons, they occur at higher elevations elsewhere, so they'll be there too.
Wow, that's fascinating. So have you done much work with scrub pythons in the Timika area?
I don't think I ever saw one. I don't think I ever saw one. It's a fascinating region because it's south of the Central Cordillera, the Central Mountain Range, where most animals are southern versions of and when you get the northern stuff on the north, whereas the green pythons around Timika are Azuria. They're the northern species.
Yeah.
They're not southern species. And somewhere in the Asmat, between Timika and Moroka, you have this region where it's maybe only 100 kilometers, where somewhere you're getting the switch between Morelia viridis and Morelia azurea. So biogeographically, but then again, you get black lyre python, so the southern lyre python in Timika. Oh no, I think you get both. I'm lying to you. I think you do get both. So we don't actually know what happens with scrubbies.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, Patrick asked if you had any theories exactly on that. Yeah, as of now, the animals that are labeled, they're the animals that I feel like, from at least my minimal research and understanding, that are labeled as oxabil are in fact coming from around Timika, and are kind of, they're southern type ish. But yeah, that's
I think in the south you get two types. As I said, I've found a bunch of scrub pythons, not in Timica, but further east, basically
yeah,
directly north of Morocco, right? Like Tanamera, for
yeah,
example.
yeah,
South of Oxabil, but in that north of Tanamera, south of Oxabil, you get Mindiptana, Waropko, sort of those areas. And you definitely get two types of southern scrub. You know, your Tanamera, or, you know, they're quite orange. They get that
yes,
orangey sort of, so you get that, let's call them Tanamera, Oxabil type animal. And then as you go further south into the come on Dan, think into the Transfly area, the where it's sort of woodland and much like Australia, then you get the typical, like, let's say amethystina looking
yeah,
southern thing, or as we discussed, probably Somalia Clarkeye, based on where the type locality is from. And so what I suspect has happened is the continent of Australia was connected to New Guinea for most of our recent history. So animals were moving back and forth between the two. Then there were periods where the sea levels changed and they were cut off. What's probably happened is, and this will be teased out when the molecular data are finally analyzed, you've got a northern New Guinea animal and a southern New Guinea animal, and they are the two, you know, the ugly and the good-looking northern thing that we just showed photos of. I'm doing them a disservice. They're all beautiful. You know what I mean? And then you get the southern animal, which is the southern counterpart of the northern one, and that is, let's say, the Timica, the Tanamera, the Oxabil, let's call it the orange thing.
yeah,
And that's what you had there is the natural state. And then Australia and New Guinea got connected again. And the thing that was occurring in Australia made a resurgence back into southern New Guinea, and it is the animal that's living in the Transfly type area, because the animals you pull in from around Morocco, and there were heaps of those, I found heaps of them, they're just like at the tip of northern Australia.
yeah,
It's not until you go north that you start to get those orange things. And so I suspect, I'm not sure if the molecular data will have enough power to really show that difference. It could just call them all southern animals, but
sure.
I suspect that's what's happened. And so it's possible you'll have two taxa inhabiting southern New Guinea. One is the Australian one, call it King Hawley, call it amethystina, whatever. One might be let's say rainforest southern. Let's call them rainforest southern versus woodland southern. They obviously could both change habitats, but for sake of ease, as you go further north in the south, you get into the rainforest after you pass through that bamboo country. And so that's what could be happening.
Is there any overlap in those populations at all, or are they pretty?
I suspect there will be, and again, I'm talking somewhat hypotheticals here. I haven't done enough time on the ground to find the area of overlap. Everything I said could also be bullshit. Keep that in mind. Let's call it informed speculation. It wouldn't surprise me if we did it all and that's how it turned out. About yeah, that's kind of what I guessed. Or it might be like, you know, the data come back and they just say, Dan, you're a fuckwit. I really don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, few people can speak on these wild accounts the way that you can, so we're definitely gonna at least take your word for it as best as you know you're able to give it. Yeah, that's so. Like, what's like the furthest west point where you're seeing those kind of Australian type animals? Are you seeing them west of Morocco, like northwest at all?
Yeah, not so much to the northwest. There's a place called Okapa. And then there's Yosadaso, the big island. What's it called? It's got an English name too. But sort of, if you look at that Transfly down the western side, there's a big. It's got carpet pythons and taipans and other things. Never found a scrub there, but certainly, yeah, that's not that far west. It's certainly not as far west as Asmat or anything like that. I can't really speak to it. It's the end of that transfly dry belt. They definitely occur, but I don't know how far further they go.
Okay. Do you have speculation, or have you found individuals of that kind of what we're calling the jungle or rainforest southern east into PNG?
Yeah, so that is east into PNG, absolutely.
Okay. How far east into PNG?
More or less all the way. They're that orangey looking thing. It's slightly less orange, but it occurs more or less all the way across down to the Owen Stanley. It's just north of Port Moresby in that area. Thinking like lake areas you might know, like Lake Katubu, which is pretty close to the border still, but across the Fly River. Basically, if you think of a belt of rainforest, all the way from the southern foothill, the foothills of the Southern Highlands, all the way across to, almost Alatau in Milne Bay. That's where they're occurring, and they're slightly different. I've only seen a couple of animals from there.
Sure. Wow, that's interesting. So essentially, just you follow the base of the mountain on the southern side. You're seeing that phenotype east to west.
Wherever there's thick rainforest, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Since we're kind of over in the in that area around the northern part of Australia, we have some questions about the different populations from Australia. So thoughts on all of this?
Good question. As I mentioned in the other talk, firstly, there are some obvious differences to those that have seen a few. For sake of ease of the conversation, let's assume they are different taxa, and let's call the southern one King Horneye, and let's call the northern Cape York ones Amethystina for now. Okay. The King Horneye ones around where I live here in the wet tropics are darker animals, which makes a bit of sense because it's colder, it's further south. They are large. They definitely grow larger, both in average size and in maximum size, based on the records we have. And they're pretty aggressive, relatively. They're not that aggressive, but relatively, they're going to have a go at you when you pick them up sooner than a Cape York or Amethystina type animal. Does any of that mean anything in terms of their systematics, or do they differ taxonomically? I don't know. It could just be a clinal variation, variation as you move down, and you do see a bit of that. But there is a point in the wet tropics called the Black Mountain Corridor, and again, now you'd think, what is that? There's no barrier to gene flow there, but historically there clearly must have been, and because animals, whether it's carpet pythons, a whole bunch of taxa, the animals north and south of Black Mountain Corridor are genetically differentiated. Okay. And we have run the mitochondrial DNA, which the nuclear DNA is more or less seems to follow perfectly for the scrub pythons. And there is a difference. But it's not huge, and it's going to come down to our discretion as experts as to whether we call them different taxa. I'm more of a lumper, to be honest. But I really can't remember. I mean, if the data are very compelling, then obviously you just follow the data. You don't really call yourself a lumper or a splitter. But my gut feeling now is they're more or less the same thing. But there are some differences, even morphologically. So we'll use other. But again, all those data are sitting in big spreadsheets somewhere. I haven't even analyzed them, so I can't tell you with great authority right at this moment.
Okay, makes sense.
What I can sort of say is that I'm much more confident the animals at the tip of Cape York are the same thing as in southern New Guinea.
Okay.
So there is greater similarity between the Northern Australia and southern New Guinea animals than there is northern Cape York versus, say, the wet tropic or King Horneye type.
Okay. So based on your knowledge and your kind of assessment of the data right now, separation of two species would be in order.
I really don't know. It could be. It could be on the cards, is all I'd say. But then again, they've already been named. It'll just be a confirmation that this thing's we're going to call King Horneye and this thing is Amethystina, and there's a broad line in this area.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's all that would happen. But there's a very good chance that we just go, no, they're all the same thing, and Amethystina is everything around the wet tropics. They just seem to be slightly different, larger animals, which is explained by this, and this thing.
Yeah.
And that animal occurs all the way up into southern New Guinea.
Okay, makes sense. So Lisa didn't let this one slip by. Somalia clarkii. What is Somalia clarkii?
Yeah, classic Lisa. She's on.
Nothing will ever.
No, exactly. I love it. So from memory, I can't remember which island. There was a scrub python back in the day, when people were still sailing around in their sailing ships collecting specimens, taken from one of the islands in the Torres Strait, and they named it, I guess, Python clarkii, or maybe it was Morelia by then, I'm not sure. Let's say Morelia clarkii. If, let's say, King Horneye turned out to be its own thing, and not Amethystina, then I believe, following the code of zoological nomenclature and the order of priority, it's possible that the animals north of where King Horneye stops, so let's say northern Cape York, and if I'm correct that they're the same as the animals in southern New Guinea, the animals in southern New Guinea would take the name of that animal found in the Torres Strait. So we'd be dealing not with Amethystina, we'd be dealing with clarkii. But that will also depend on exactly where the type specimen for Amethystina was taken.
Sure.
Because if that turns out to be the same thing, wherever that is, it was probably in northern New Guinea, though. I should know the answer to this, but let's say Amethystina's type locality is Jayapura, then they will, and let's say we're going to make an assumption that there's a north and south thing, then the northern thing would be Amethystina, both assuming the ugly one and the pretty one are the same thing, then they would be Amethystina. In southern New Guinea, let's say that the orange thing is different to the other thing, to this Australian and southern New Guinea animal, then its name would probably be open unless there is a name existing. I think there may also be a name existing that starts with D that I've forgotten. And then the animals in Australia and southern New Guinea would be clarkii if King Horneye is a thing. So it's basically, it all depends on where in the hierarchy.
Lots of factors.
Exactly.
So then if I'm following all of this, which I might not be, let's say it is all split, you would have King Horneye, and then you'd have clarkii, which would range from those Cape York animals through like Maruki, but then those, let's call it like the jungle southerns, that would not fall into clarkii?
It would not fall into clarkii if they're the same as the southern animals. If all the animals in southern New Guinea, including Maroki, let's say jungle-y things versus non-jungle, they're the same thing, then they'd be clarkii. But then again, there's that other name that escapes me. Maybe that was coined earlier than clarkii, in which case all of those animals we just mentioned would be this other. It's a weird name. It's someone's surname. It's like It's like like Zoe Deschanel or that actress.
Yeah.
It's a name like that. It'll be like Morelia Deschanel or something.
Huh. I hope not, because that's complicated. People are gonna fuck that up.
It is a bit. I don't know if on my computer. I'll keep talking, but no. Nick Mutton and old Ryan Young, and then we were collaborating because they were working on this. They had a bunch of morphological samples from their specimens that they were pretty sure when they imported them, they knew the locality. And so we were going to do something together, and then COVID happened and it all sort of evaporated. But they're probably, I don't know, maybe I'm going to hazard a guess that they spend more time thinking about this sort of thing than I do. So maybe they know the potential names, and they can interject perhaps. Or correct me in the politest way possible, please, Ryan.
Yeah, based on the last episode, maybe it won't be the most polite way possible, but
no, I prefer it that way. Got to get my chops busted every now and then.
That's how real science is done.
Exactly.
Oh, that's funny. I want to switch gears a little bit because you mentioned that you had run into scrub pythons on Aru. Would this animal roughly resemble those by which you found on Aru?
Yeah, but basically a southern animal, right?
Yeah, kind of like a more highly colored, tightly patterned southern animal.
Yeah, I mean you get animals in Australia that more or less look like that. There is, again, I don't know if I had maybe on Instagram. If people went to my Instagram, you can see. Maybe what I'll do, if people are interested, I'll go to my Instagram and I'll look for the photos of scrub pythons, and I can change up the caption to have it say something that is obvious, to be like, this animal comes from the same place as this other animal.
Okay.
You see some of them are like super bright orangey yellow, and others are just a dull kind of grey brown, and they're found a kilometer away from one another in the same population. It's the sort of difference that people in the hobby that don't see huge numbers or don't necessarily know the exact localities would be like, wow, that's a northern New Guinea animal and the other's a southern New Guinea. But like, not literally, I found them 500 meters apart. There's that sort of difference. But again, I'm talking in a bell curve of a population, right?
Sure.
They're the outliers.
Sure. Yeah, I see one of these. This is going to be real Bush League, but this is one of the posts. Is this kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those are animals from all over the place, but yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, I know personally I'd be fascinated by that, and I think there's a lot of people that would be as well. Because like we've been saying, this especially in the U.S. hobby. And Europe as well has been a point of contention for a long time as to these like locality type name labels on these snakes. And my thought has always been, let's not say anything specific until we know for sure. And I think if this conversation has told us anything, is that we definitely don't know for sure. And there's probably almost no way with our captive animals, and especially our captive bred animals, of placing some sort of label on them. Considering animals that we thought were, the so to speak, ugly northern and pretty northern, we thought they came from hundreds of miles or thousands of miles apart from each other, when you said you found them in the same location. That changes the paradigm for all of us, for sure. And I'm very grateful for that, because I always love learning new stuff about these animals that I'm fascinated in, and I know a lot of other scrub fans out here do as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's human tendency as well. I think most of the importers get it broadly right. There's just so many levels. I've not got into fights. Fights would be too strong a word, but let's say I do have opinions, because I've been there and seen it with my own eyes. Opinions on just how much credibility you can give a locality type when it's come through a supply chain like this. You've got the hunter who might who might catch an animal in Lehre, let's say, or in the base of let's use a southern example. They might have a friend that gets the animal in Oxabil and then drives down to the village in Tanamera. There's a route, and gives it to his friend that he knows buys snakes. And then the Tanamera guy, he will drive to Marorki, and he goes and picks up snakes from all of the guys that catch snakes and supply to him along the way. And then and some of those will get mixed, or they won't. He'll be like, oh, that one's, these guys are not at that level. They don't care about your desire to know about the locality. Yeah. So they're just snakes in bags. And this guy, he just collects snakes. He doesn't look at them and go, oh, that one's different, and it came from that area. So they're all being mixed. And then he'll get there to Marorki, to the wildlife trader, and be like, okay, here's all your snakes. And he goes, great. Where'd they all come from? Between here and Tanamera. And so the guy who's the wildlife trader in Marorki will just go, oh, I label them all Tanamera. And you've got an Oxabil in the box, you've got an Aziki, you've got a Mooting. These are places between Tanamera and Marorki. You've got all this stuff where he stopped. They've all kind of been mixed. Or there might be other times where he goes, one came from Oxabil. And they'll go, oh, well, which one? And he'll go, this one, I'm pretty sure. And then he hands the Aziki animal over saying it's the Oxabil. And then it gets to and there's various other steps further along in the process where things can get muddled up, and suddenly you just don't know shit. And so some of these studies that use genetic information, taking your captive animal and saying, I know it's from here, I'm going to take a DNA sample and do a genetic study. I'm just like, well, I'm just placing no credibility on that based on what I've seen. Having said all that, though, I'd say 80% of the time they are broadly correct. I'm giving an example of quite a long supply chain that's logistically pretty convoluted. Most of the time it's, this came from the broad area of Jayapura, not in the city, but from Arso or from Sentani or the Cyclops Mountains or something, which is it's like 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers away. It's still just a Jayapura region animal. And so they just call it all a Jayapura. And it's like, for that purpose, it's more or less fine. But then when the two Jayapuras come in the door, and one of them is that what you called a Manokwari, and the other looks like a typical Jayapura, you guys potentially as hobbyists go, well, they can't be the same thing. They must be, one's a highland animal versus a lowland or we try to fit things into boxes. That's what we do as humans. And that's just they came from, they're siblings actually.
We try to rationalize it in a way that calms our minds. So we're like, we're safe in our box of knowing what we know. Yeah.
I mean, that's also what makes it so fascinating. How fucking boring. How boring would it be if we knew all these answers?
Well, and that's kind of part of what Brandon's kind of comment here is that there's, as over like the last 6 years or so, I would say this is when in the U.S. scrub python breeding has started to become more regular. And, within clutches of animals, we see wild variability. I guess the two theories that are considered, one is that they really, like we've been talking about, there really isn't a whole lot of specificity with phenotype and location. The other theory was, well, this is the result of a cross pairing, is that there's this wild array of phenotypes because the two adults are not of the same type or whatever you want to say. I mean, from your perspective, do you think it's one over the other or a mixture of two? Hard to say.
I really don't know. It could be. Yeah. It'll likely be a mixture of two. I mean, maybe you guys can tell me, like, what the hell's going on with those patternless scrub pythons? They are. I mean, can you get them in the same clutch as patterned animals?
So, actually, I'm glad you mentioned. I just had a clutch hatch from a what we would call in the hobby here a patterned Maruki female and a patternless Maruki male, both wild caught, and 6 babies hatched from the clutch, all patterned. But just anecdotally, and they're still small, unchanged, but they have a lot of pattern, but kind of like tighter pattern than the mom. Ryan Young would tell you that patternless is a recessive trait. Based on that reproduction of a patternless to a patterned animal, no patternless, that would probably lend towards Ryan's theory. And would probably also lend to your theory, or your example of finding a patternless and a patterned animal in the almost meters away from each other. It seems to also go that way with the Tannenbar scrub pythons, where the patternless mutation seems to also be recessive.
You also get patternless animals in the north, which is weird again, in northern New Guinea.
So, and let me ask you this: the northern patternless animals, do they have a neck bar, or is it completely patternless from neck down?
I've only seen one, and I'll need to dig up the photo because I don't remember. I've only ever, and it was in PNG. It was in the Sepik area, so over the border from Jayapura.
Okay.
I never saw a patternless animal in the north.
Okay.
On the Indonesian side, I want to say.
Okay.
Even in traders' places, I just saw one animal in PNG, and because they occur, my theory is they're all the same. A political boundary makes no difference to a population of animals. I assume that they also have patternless stuff around Jaipur and probably all the way to Sarong.
Wow, I'd be fascinated to see, because I can't say I've seen one. I did have an animal about 5 years ago that it was patternless completely, and it was kind of like, it was a little more gold than the southern patternless animals, and I feel like some of the morphology more or less resembled a northern animal. The one thing that really tripped me up with that individual was it had a solid pale pink tongue, which the hobby associates with the Jayapura area, which, based on our conversation, is totally thrown out of the window. Have you seen variety in tongue coloration or pattern in these different regions?
I've never paid that much attention.
Okay, so. Fair enough. Yeah, because it seems to be all over the place, but then there seems to be some consistency. Like, for instance, this northern phenotype, 100% of the time has a solid pale pink tongue, and that's even when they're babies. That's like one of the if you get an imported bunch, it's one of the main ways that we distinguish this phenotype from what I was calling the Manokwari, but just that other northern phenotype is the tongue coloration, which. So anyway, just another kind of anecdote that I.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, there was a point. If you go north, I mean, you can Google these places. Google Muting and Aziki. In that area, I was finding more. Again, I'm talking fewer than 10 animals, so it's not like I know that much, but more patternless animals than patterned animals.
Okay.
And also in discussion with the traders, was never under the impression that the patternless animals were actually around Merauke. So what I'm trying to say is the patternless animals were, if we think of it like this, we have the Tanamera, for example. Let's call them the orange thing that we called the jungle thing before. And then you have an area where it's still rainforest, but then where you got the patterned and patternless, what look like southern things, but it's still rainforest. And then you had an area here, and this area is bamboo and woodland and sort of dry transfly Australian typical type habitat.
Sure.
Only ever found the typical patterned southern Moroki looking animals there. And talking with traders was under the impression that they didn't really get the patternless one occurring around Moroki, that it came from further north. That all being said, we're talking low sample sizes, so I could just be full of crap.
Well, I mean, it's great though, because for what you consider a low sample size, to all of us is like the first good information we've ever gotten. You know, I mean, this hour and 45 is definitely like Tim said earlier, you dropped a nuclear bomb on what we consider scrub python localities in the U.S. trade. So you know, this definitely this changes everything for us. So Lisa wants to know, and I guess based on what you just said, probably not. Are there patternless animals in Australia?
One has never been recorded.
Okay, so there seems to be that patternless belt in the southern population. To put it in simple terms, the jungle orange animals, the kind of intermediate zone with the patternless, and then south of that to Australia, the typical pattern kind of woodland scrub.
Sure. Exactly what,
more or less,
based on what I just said. But if someone who'd spent time there was like, well, I found a pattern one, and that'd be like, I will completely wouldn't surprise me. It's just like, oh, well,
based on your current information, though.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. I want to go back to the Aru animals for a minute. How many animals roughly would you have said you encountered on Aru? Just one.
Just one.
Okay.
Yeah.
How big was that animal?
It was relatively small.
Okay.
You know, it would have been in the 1 to 2 meter mark and closer to the 1 meter mark.
Oh, okay. So yeah. there's definitely there's a bit of controversy surrounding those animals in the trade, where some people claim that they're like a dwarf island locality type, and others, myself included, disagree with that statement. What would your thoughts be on the Aru population?
Aru's a big place.
Definitely.
And so I'd see no reason why they would be dwarf animals.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's been connected to Moroki and those, you know, like in evolutionary time, probably 10,000 years ago, it was easily, I've got all those maps. They're all somewhere. If you read my green python thesis, I think it's all in there.
Okay.
I could be lying to you, but I think that's right. There's no reason I can see, in just basic understanding and logic, why they would be dwarf animals.
Okay. Yeah.
And the animal I saw was just young. It wasn't a dwarf.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, for reference, my largest Aru animal is about 12 feet. So, you know,
okay.
About 4 meters. So, yeah, that I'm not of that you know, that opinion, but some people are. And another animal that I'm very curious, since you said you've spent a good amount of time on the island for green pythons, but is the Biak scrub python that my picture did not pull up. There we go. How I guess similar kind of line of questioning to Aru. How many individuals have you found on Biak?
I think I've seen 2 live ones, definitely, at least. Okay. And then my memory might come up with more later. And then I've seen a couple of road kills as well, which is always, you know, as illuminating, because you get right up close and check out all the little bits and pieces on them. One was a bit mangled, but basically what you showed is kind of what they look like.
Yeah.
A bit. Some of them are, I remember one was lighter. You know, that thing, if you go back, that thing looks like it's almost, is it just shed, or is it?
No, yeah, it probably just recently it shed.
You know how some, you know, how they begin to darken is just before they shed, they get dull and things.
Yeah.
So it could have been as simple as one animal had recently shed its skin and the other hadn't. But three were definitely like that, and then the other, let's say, more lighter or more orange.
Okay. Yeah, these animals, I mean, they've always fascinated me. I've only been able to interact with a small sample size. But what's most fascinating to me is that, much like the Halmaheras, they're born with their adult coloration, which, you know, we don't see with any of what else is classified under Amethystina currently. I mean, do you, from your wild encounters, see these as maybe like a different species or something that's diverged from the Amethystina population?
Not based on what I've seen.
Okay.
Again, you know, 4 animals is not
Sure.
not many, and I just like, you know, I try to be circumspect. I just don't have the confidence to say
Yeah,
anything.
for sure.
And so I try not to. But what I know about Biak, there's a good possibility that those animals are distinct, just like the green pythons.
Okay.
It's an oceanic island. Those animals get there through rafting and other things. I mean, they would have been much closer during periods of glaciation and sea level drop to the mainland and Yapen and other places. But and so the bridge would have been quite easy, but it has been cut off for much longer. And so there's a good chance that those animals are on their own evolutionary trajectory.
Okay.
And typically the sort of prevailing thinking within the taxonomy nerds is that, yeah, things might not be too dissimilar now, but if you have good reason to believe that allopatry or geographic separation is going to continue into the future, then it can't necessarily hurt to name those things as separate taxa, because you know that as more time goes on, they are just going to diverge more from their mainland conspecifics. And so it's a bit safer, say, to, in some of those unique cases, like an oceanic island, say that they're a different taxon.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And you said you only saw 4 animals. What was like the largest individual of those 4?
One of them was fucking huge. One of them was like 5 meters long.
No shit. Of that dark phenotype, like this animal that we're showing.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And it was in it was in Bosnik. Bosnik is on the sort of east coast. Now, I didn't find it. It was actually during the day, and the villagers found it and were going nuts. And they were just going nuts. They didn't even call us because we just went down, and it was right near the sort of the beach along a stone wall thing. And yeah, it was huge.
Wow.
It was huge.
Wow. Because my anecdotal evidence, I guess, of being a keeper in the US has told me that these snakes might be smaller than the rest of the Amethystina, but apparently not, because 5 meters is a fucking monster.
No, I mean, I didn't measure it, but it was a chunky chunk. One of the largest animals I've ever seen across the entire range of, like I said, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals.
Yeah.
Many of which I have measured to the millimeter, and so it'd be in the top 10 for sure. Maybe I'm exaggerating, and it was 4 meters something, but it was not small.
Okay. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And then there's that whole, you know, Dave Barker and those guys, Chippendale, I know the Harvey paper that looked into scrub pythons using a bit of genetic data, and it lumped the Merauke animals and the Biak animals together. It said that the Biak animals were southern animals. To be honest, I think either that was a mix-up in the laboratory, or there are, like, for example, there are wild frill-neck lizards on Biak. There are wild wolf snakes. There are also wild now Merauke scrub pythons on Biak because of animals that have escaped from traders. Because back in the day, during the Second World War, Biak was a key military site. Or let's say there was a big American Air Force base there. And so that left pretty good infrastructure in the form of a runway that could take jumbo jets. And back in the day, you used to have direct flights from LA to Biak. So you used to get to Indonesia from LA via Biak.
Wow.
And there's Biak's a freaking weird place. And there's this, every time I go, it gets more and more degraded. But sitting in the jungle is this 5-star resort that when the direct flights were there.
Lisa is a psychic. She literally commented that about 15 seconds before you said it. I'm not even sure how that's possible.
Yeah, Lisa knows her stuff. So there's this resort, and I've got photos somewhere. It was, I remember the first time I went, maybe I didn't take photos, but it was far more impressive, like the pool and, all the tiling work and all this. And some investor had predicted that it was going to take off because of these flights, right? And then and I can't remember what the airline was, but they stopped the flights, and so there was no money, there was no tourists, and so they just walked out of this massive resort.
Oh my God!
Maybe it wasn't even completely finished, but yeah, I don't know why I'm tangenting with that. The point being though that because it was a big transport hub, a logistical hub, many of the animal now it's not a problem because the other towns have their infrastructure has improved, but to get to Western Indonesia, back into Bali or Jakarta and places like that, you had to fly from Merauke to Biak. And so a lot of the traders used to be based on Biak and would get animals from all over New Guinea and then send them out. And so that's why frill-necked lizards, like most of, I'll temper that because I don't know what proportion is what, but a good number of the frill-necked lizards that enter the trade don't come from southern New Guinea. They're coming from the wild in Biak because there's so many now that they're able to harvest them for the trade. And so there has been an escape of southern scrub pythons, which might do something. And so I don't know whether it was a case of that, and that was the sample that was used in that paper, or whether it was a lab screw up.
Okay, it makes sense.
Yeah, I've spoken to the Dave Barkers of the world, and they obviously deny it profusely, but there's just no logical reason why those animals, a deep southern animal, about as far as you can get, would match with the almost most northerly population of an oceanic island.
Yeah.
Northern animal. That's just not plausible.
Huh. So it's Biak is like the Everglades of New Guinea, huh?
Well, nowhere near as bad, but yes.
Proportionally speaking. Wow. That's fascinating. I did not know that.
They've also got reticulated pythons in Jayapura. They've got macaque monkeys, like from Western Indonesia. It's probably going to become an issue.
Huh. Wow.
And so some of those things have been there for decades now.
Huh. And it's just not really a known thing outside of the local area, probably.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not a known thing at all. I mean, I was the first person who recorded wolf snakes from Biak. It's like Lycodon capucinus. It's a little animal. And I was like dead on the road. And I was like, what? I stopped for all roadkill. And so what's this? And it's a freaking wolf snake. And they shouldn't be on New Guinea. But they're quite well known for getting into shipping containers or just getting into places, and then there's an accidental release. And so now, and this was, there's a chance that animal was the one individual that managed to stow away in a shipping container, but it wasn't near the docks. It was out in the forest. And, you could argue, well, the thing that came off the shipping container went onto the truck and that drove out into the forest. But I'm pretty sure there's a population of wolf snakes, invasive wolf snakes on Biak as well.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, to have no concept of this stuff happening and then to hear about it definitely just changes your idea of everything that's going on over there. Is the infrastructure in Biak now did it kind of just deteriorate as the island wasn't used for as much kind of Western needs?
Again, I mean, it broadly has deteriorated because the money is not there. I mean,
Right.
Biak's it's quite a touristy place. Like you can fly, maybe not directly from Jakarta, but you can fly from Makassar directly to Biak. They had reefs. They've sort of got. I mean, back when I went back in the day, it was not that touristy, but going back more recently, it's kind of, reasonably touristy. But I think the runway is still of legal length to take the large planes. There's just no real desire or market for people to go from the States to little old Biak. Yeah. I mean, apart from all you guys, of course, all the herd nerds jumping on the planes together and heading out into the jungle and Biak, it would have been great, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, to hear that is like, wow, that sounds like an opportunity right there. Because I mean, that's for me in the next probably few years or so, that's a major goal, is to try to do at least some sort of expedition to do something. It's just, obviously a lot of the narrative about New Guinea is that it's pretty dangerous for Westerners, particularly, if you're a white skinned person. I would only assume that's a case by case kind of thing, but generally speaking, for somebody from America, like, what is like kind of the soft entry into, traveling into New Guinea?
I mean, to be honest, I mean, again, I don't know the actual stats, but I suspect it is no more dangerous. In fact, probably less dangerous than many of the larger cities in the United States, unfortunately. And that's just, places like Sarong, the Raja Ampat Archipelago, Manokwari, Biak, Merauke, they're pretty safe. At least they were when I was there. I mean, maybe safety is relative, and I've got a higher, tolerance to risk, and I certainly wasn't a higher tolerance. I think it was actually just naive stupidity. Some of the things we did, I wouldn't do again. But and you had to talk your way out of some situations with the guy holding the machete. But
I grew up in Chicago, and I never had a machete pulled on me, so it might be a little more dangerous than our cities.
Machetes there are like your guns. They're fairly ubiquitous. They're just a tool,
Well, I never had a gun pulled either. So.
And so, no, look, there's a range of safe places you can go to.
Sure.
It's more just speaking the language. I speak the language, and so makes life so much easier. And and just not expecting a luxurious tourist thing. There's not a lot of infrastructure for tourists, or at least the sort of infrastructure that you'd expect. It's not like going to the south of Spain and having a really nice holiday. It's you're in a developing country with shit hotels that have mosquitoes all through the toilets and inside, and so you're never fully comfortable, and it's freaking hot, and the food's very foreign, and most people don't like it. There's no signposts for anything. The guidebooks are all out of date and wrong, and you can't speak to anyone to ask, where the hell do I go now? But that's not unsafe. That's just annoying,
Sure. Yeah, I definitely get that.
Yeah.
I mean, as an English speaker, what's the? Do you just need to find an interpreter somehow, some way, or what's like?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people take guides. I see on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, people are getting into. There's that big bald guy, Dan Mullery or something. He goes. There's that Chris Applin guy who does the monitor lizards. I guess they're all taking guides, and I don't know who they use or find, but there are people that can speak English. You're just going to pay. I'm a cheap ass. I'm a cheap ass, and so I decided to learn the language. And I literally had no money. I think I lived in New Guinea for 2 years, taking flights and motorbike on something like 20 grand that I'd saved building in Sydney, and like I sold a car and that's just what I lived on. I just ate rice and fish with the locals every time. It was, I mean, I wouldn't do it now, but because I'm way softer now. But it really just depends what you're into, you know.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I've got you know, I'm getting personal, but a relatively new girlfriend, and she's from can't say too much actually, can I? She's from a let's say a city, and she said, "What's a nice holiday?" And I said, "How about Papua?" And so last year we went to Papua, and I think the only complaint that I got was, "Why are you going out looking for snakes every night? Can't we just sit on the beach and have a romantic evening?"
Fair enough.
And I obviously explained that wasn't possible. But, you know, I think the only, you know, the food is every day we ate rice, bananas, fish, and sort of but, you know, she was absolutely fine, and it's doable, and obviously helps that I'm there and know things and know the language, but it's just not that bad, you know.
Sure.
People have the time of their life, and that's the adventure. You just got to go do it, and things will fuck up, and there'll be annoyance, and there might be a few tears, but it's just, that's all part of it. It's super fun. That's what makes life fun.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel like a lot of Americans were a little bit too insulated in our little safety bubbles that we've formed for ourselves, so that the thought of doing something like a trip to Papua seems super daunting.
Yeah, no, it's like I said, if I'd be happy to take a few people if I can find some time, and my time gets covered, I can.
Yeah,
you know, you can do something like that. It's not too challenging, and then once a group's done it, then they can start taking people. You know, but really, it's not that difficult.
Well, that sounds pretty freaking awesome. Yeah, you've mentioned this region a couple of times, and this is one that I'm fascinated by, because to my estimation, I doubt we have animals in the U.S. hobby from here, but the Raja Ampat archipelago. What is your experience out there with scrub pythons?
I found a couple on Wagyu, but I think no, they were both small. You know how you just can't quite get a sense of the animal when they're quite small?
Yeah, for sure.
I want to see how the pattern evolves when they get bigger and a bit of stuff. So those sort of things, it's difficult to speak about. Wagyu, Masul, yeah, the beautiful one that I mentioned, the individual I found on Masul was like that. Yeah, that's the one.
Was it more heavily, like where the bar is darker, like a darker black?
I can't remember. Okay. There'll be a photograph somewhere. And then, yeah, that's more or less it from memory. Salawati, yeah, Kofiau. I think I might have seen a Kofiau animal in a trader's, in a trader's place, but I could even be fibbing there. And then saw a couple of additional animals in the trader's place in Sarong. And again, there was nothing based on the small sample. You know, if they were green pythons, it'd go, oh yeah, they are slightly different. But even then, I couldn't really technically differentiate a Salawati, Batanta, or Wagyu green python from a mainland Sarong green python. And the same is true with scrubs. You know, I could probably get a guess right better than 50% of the time. But again, because there is that variation in white and then connectivity of the blue stripe on green pythons, it's just like, you know, there's just way more variation within a population than people think. And yeah, there are broad bins that the animals fit into, which we call locality types. But, you know, unless it's like a southern animal, big white vertebral stripe versus northern animal, the big blue vertebral stripe, and it's very obvious. It's for the finer scale localities, say between the different islands, because keeping in mind, Raja Ampat, a sea level drop of in the last 10,000 years, all those islands were connected to Sarong, and 10,000 years is no time in evolutionary time, and so it makes sense that they're more or less the same. Which also makes it fascinating why all those monitors are all different colors, because they've also been, you know, they're no different to a scrub python. Salawati or when Batanta was connected, or Wagio was connected, or Missil was connected. So were the scrub pythons, so were the monitor lizards. The scrub pythons all look the same, more or less, and then the freaking monitors are all colors of the rainbow. It's bizarre.
Yeah, oh, definitely. So the Kofiau animals, and I know you said you haven't found any on Kofiau, correct?
No.
There's kind of some lore around them in captivity of like, the definition in a captive sense of a Kofiau scrub python is an animal with very little pattern, but like broken, irregular, weird pattern. And some people will say that they're like the giants, like, 15, 16 foot individuals. I mean, have you heard anything or whatnot that would back that up, or is that just hobby science?
No, I've never heard that. With a lot of these things, though, the hobby is obviously there's some classic cases where it's wrong, but often it's right. And
Okay.
it is, island gigantism is a thing. Island dwarfism is a thing, and so it's possible that our Aru is a stretch. I doubt they would be dwarfs because it's just so big. But Kofiau's tiny. But you would expect them to be dwarfs because I don't think there's a lot of big prey on Kofiau. One, because it's small, and two, because because it's small, it's been more heavily overexploited. It's been overhunted by the locals much more than some of the bigger other islands.
Okay.
Yeah, but then again, if you've got animals growing to 16 foot and you can't get your Moroccans and other animals to even grow that big, then shit, there may be something to it.
Yeah, it's hard to say because it's from a couple instances, and who knows if what that necessarily was. Because I had an animal that was sold to me as a Kofiau type as an adult. That was, it was about 14, 15 foot long. It was the biggest scrub python I've ever seen in person. And it phenotypically followed what you'd call that based on our limited evidence. But again, it's just like, could that be an outlier individual? There was another animal that was in Ireland that fit the bill very similarly, a very large animal. But again, it's just a case of low sample size,
It's who knows? There might not even be scrub pythons on Kofiau. That's the sort of, and sorry, I'm not. What I mean is, you just don't know. There's the guy who, his name was Nasir Burung, and Burung means bird because he used to be a bird trader. And Nasir, I suppose I can speak about him now. He's heavily involved in all the illegal stuff, but he's a lovely guy. And there's enough water under the bridge, and I'm sure I can talk about it now. But yeah, he knew exactly that the trade liked the locality type stuff. So he was one of the main traders in the center, and he knew all about Kofiau's, and he knew all about this and that. It just would not surprise me but he's a money maker, he's a businessman. It would not surprise me if he gets a slightly different animal from a place and it's just like, this is a Kofiau. When actually there's never been maybe they're not even on the island. I'm sure they probably are.
According to Patrick, and I do remember this video, Dan O'Leary has found scrubs on Kofiau. But
okay, well, perfect. But the point still remains is that anyone can create a new. It's like the Pedido. Now, the great example is the guy on Biak. You have the Pedido Island green pythons, and now the Pedido Islands are a real thing. They are islands, and all of those mottled high yellow Biaks, everyone that would come in, he would sell for extra as Pedido animals. And I've probably found more green pythons on Biak than any other place in New Guinea. And those high yellow animals, maybe there's more of them on Pedido, but they occur throughout Biak and Sapuri Islands. And so what he was basically doing, I'm pretty sure I talked to him about this. He was just taking the high yellow animals from all over Biak and putting them in a different bag and saying, they're the Pedido ones, you pay twice the price because they're nice high yellow. And that's just basic business, but it's not true.
Sure. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, but that does, and that's kind of what we're fighting, against here in the hobby is like we know that this kind of shady labeling happens, and there was a couple flippers in the States who, you know, like for instance, with white lip pythons, Dan Malary had imported a group of white lip pythons that were from Tamika that, he was like, they all just seem to have very good temperaments. These animals are not aggressive like I see with my normal white lip pythons. And then this other flipper, white lip pythons, all of a sudden, every black animal for the next year and a half was a Tamika, magically. And probably wasn't, but it's just I always just find it funny at this point because it's just so like I feel like it's kind of just it's played out over here where it's pretty obvious when that's what you're up to. But then for us who want to be serious about locality separation, it makes that task virtually impossible.
No, it is. It's frustrating. It's frustrating because you want to know and you think you know, but you'll never be 100% sure. It would annoy me if I was doing it for sure. So I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here comes Lisa again with another hard hitter. Have you had any experience with animals in the Bismarck archipelago?
No, not. I've never been, to be honest. Never been to the Bismarcks. I would love to go, also for the ringed pythons.
Yes.
But I have seen a lot of them because I've been to most of the museums around the world that have got big collections of scrub pythons as part of this taxonomic revision that hopefully will get done one day. And so I've seen a lot in jars, which is not the same, but you do see the pattern and head scalation and all that sort of thing. Yeah, again, they're northern type animals, definitely northern type animals rather than southern, but like a bar necky type thing. And they're actually, again, I want to say based on scale counts and head scalation and all that they are quite different. Actually, they're quite different to the mainland stuff. But again, don't quote me, and I can't remember exactly what it was. Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
So point being, it wouldn't surprise me when we do the. I don't believe in morphological stuff very much for these. Those however many 100 scrub pythons I captured for my PhD, every single one, its head would go beside a ruler and it would get a head photograph. And again, the sort of variation within a single population, other taxonomists would use to describe 5 different species. And so I just don't believe, don't place too much credibility in a lot of the meristic or the scale count type stuff. So the genetic data is king in my view. And it wouldn't surprise me if once the genetic data are run, and we do have samples, that those Bismarck animals turn out to be different.
Yeah. Kind of related, but a bit of a diversion from the scrubs. Yeah, that to me, as someone who's not a scientist, just observing scalation within like a very specific, like kind of, it's late, I'm losing my words, but very slight differentiation to me seemed like a strange indicator of species. I'm, secondary to scrub pythons, I'm very into a lot of Mexican wildlife, particularly the rattlesnakes. But then alongside of those come like the Abronia species and whatnot, where, there are full species that were described off of 1 or 2 scales that are different. And these animals are from, this very similar areas. And then obviously I bet there was a lot of molecular data that went along with it. But I mean, does something like that for you as a scientist, do you see, I guess you kind of just said that, but like, do you really take a lot of that seriously when it comes to like those very minute morphological differences?
I'm sure that in some cases they're a wonderful diagnostic, and they're underpinned by a strong genetic divergence, right? And so they are, but there are those other cases where you can have differences in scale counts or positioning or whatever, and they just mean nothing in an evolutionary sense. And given you can't differentiate between which one is a great diagnostic that's actually meaningful for taxonomic purposes and which is just a random, mutation or whatever in scalation, I just prefer to be cautious and take a blanket approach and say, I'll still do all of it. I collect all the bloody scale data, which is on a scrub python, having 300 ventral scales. That's a bloody annoying task, right? And so I still collect all that. I just don't place a lot of emphasis on it because I don't know in which occasions it's meaningful and which it's not. I mean, we've done studies on slaty grey snakes here in Australia where incubation humidity influences head scalation. The parietal scales on the head are completely different depending on what, and you can have siblings from the same genetic material basically incubated at different temperatures with different humidities, and that will impact the scalation in a way that's consistent. And so when you know stuff like that, and I think I used that argument in the Python paper that I wrote, where basically that had been done, 5 different species, all described based on scalation, when in reality, small samples and all of that, and it just doesn't add up. It's the molecular stuff that will ultimately tell us what's going on. Yeah,
it's actually kind of goes into this question right here pretty seamlessly about kind of the differences in the large head scales of the scrub pythons. So based on what you were saying, do you think that could just be an incubation anomaly of when they're fused or they're separated, or there's little small scales in between the 4 main head scales? I don't know the names of the scales, but
I mean, what I'm saying is basically it's a cop-out answer, but I just don't know. So to that question, I have a photograph of the head, the side of the head, the front, everything, for thousands of scrub pythons from all over, from every nook and cranny of New Guinea and Australia. So I have all that. I haven't analyzed any of it. Maybe I'll send it to Ryan Young and he can do it, the sucker. And I think he's done some stuff too, and Nick Mutton's done some stuff. And broadly, there are differences. And this is what Dave Barker and those guys who wrote that original scrub python paper, they found there are differences. It's about consistency in those differences. If you have like northern scrub python versus southern scrub python in New Guinea, if one of them has 4 scales always in this place and the other always has 3 or fewer, so 2 or 3, and that's perfectly consistent, then wicked. That's a great diagnostic for differentiating those 2 species and is meaningful. But what that actually means in terms of your change in DNA overall as you diverge as a different species, it may not be very indicative of the gap or the degree of separation, because it can be as simple as 1 year it was just they had a big cold snap in New Guinea, and so really shit example, and it doesn't work like this, but I'll continue anyway. There's a cold snap and all the eggs come out, and the vast majority of them have only 2 or 3 of that head scale, in which the southern ones have 4, and then they all have better survival and they pass on their genetic material. So eventually over time, you've got a northern population with 2 or 3 scales and the southern one with 4 or more, let's say. And that can happen in a very short evolutionary time period where the rest of the genetic material hasn't diverged. So the genetics will show you that they're more or less the same thing, but there is a consistent difference in that morphological character. And then there'll be other things which are heritable and polygenic, meaning they influence other genes, and they are a great diagnostic of heavily or deeply divergent clades or taxa occurring in different areas. And it's just, you just don't know. And so, you use them as a diagnostic tool, but don't suggest that they have a bearing on evolutionary distinctiveness or degree of divergence, if this makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It definitely, it makes the brain hurt to think about too much, but I can only imagine that you gain some gray hairs having to deal with a lot of this minutia within the taxonomic world.
Yeah, you do a bit, and I guess I've got to the point where I don't try to speculate anymore. I'm basically, my position is I don't give a shit until I have all the data. I'm not going to think about it, and that's why I haven't analyzed some of this, because I know I'm the sort of personality that would sit there going, "Ooh, I wonder if da da da." It's just like, I'm just going to wait until it's all done, and then I'll make up my mind once I have all the information. Also, it's going to help to not bias me if I start, because people do this often. They're like, "Oh, I think this is like this," and so then as more data come, they start searching for it, and confirmation bias creeps in, and suddenly you're looking and searching for all those examples that validate your previous hypothesis or previous assumption, and that's not a healthy way to do science.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably what a lot of the hobby falls victim to often, in terms of, discussions like what we've been having tonight, or with whatever else, is just you're very committed to your idea, and the thought of changing that hurts the ego so much that you're not willing to open your mind to what the truth might actually be.
Yeah. And then that's sort of why in some of these talks, people probably get frustrated with it and think I'm a dick, but I use words like speculate, or I'll be like, but I don't actually know that, or what I said could be bullshit, because I'd feel bad if people went away and said, "Oh, well, Dan's been there and he said it's like this and this," and it's when it could just be, I could just be wrong, because I don't know, you know what I mean? And yeah, people shouldn't be going away and saying this is gospel. It's like, this is the very little bit that we know now, and that could be turned on its head tomorrow when someone hopefully goes and does more.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the last things I want to cover, since we've mostly been sticking to the mainland, New Guinea into Australia, have you been out to the Maluku Archipelago, Halmahera, to do anything out there as far as work with these animals? Tanimbar?
Tanimbar, and then not for scrubs, but I've found they're pretty common. They're common on Tanimbar. I've got colleagues in the Indonesian government, good friends, and they're sort of the herp people within the government, and they went semi-recently. I want to say they got like 10 animals in a very short time on Tanimbar. Nice. Didn't see anything super sexy. And then Saram, I saw one in a trader's place. I've spent time on Saram, but I didn't see any in the bush myself. I think I saw one in a trader's place, and I think it was in Jakarta that I saw it. Yeah.
And then anything with Halmahera?
I've never been there. I'd love to. Never been.
Okay. Yeah, that's a dream for me. Speaking on Halmahera, I don't know, William, if you're still here, but he asked a lot earlier if you have any interest in any potential splitting of the reticulated pythons, and then any thoughts on the theory that Halmahera reticulated pythons may be introduced. And I haven't heard of that before, which I'm very curious about. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, William, and also a big shout out to William. William made a donation to the IUCN specialist group for the conservation of snakes, which you probably didn't advertise to everyone, but that was very much appreciated, buddy. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
And it is going towards good work that the IUCN is doing. On that question, splitting I probably do much more with Retics now than I do with any of the New Guinea stuff. A lot of the stuff I'm actually talking to you about happened almost 20 years ago, right? 10, 15, 20 years ago. Whereas the Retic stuff is far more recent. Maybe some of you have read a bunch of papers I've written. A lot of it is on the sustainability side. Mark Aulier, he and I don't see eye to eye all the time, but he did a molecular study on Retics, thinking that they would all be differentiated across the different islands, and they more or less were all the same. There was across the mainland, Indochina, all the way down through the Indonesian islands. One of the differences was the Philippine population was slightly different, but I don't even think enough to say, a splitter might split them off.
Sure.
But I think a lumper might just say, look, they are slightly different. They've been separated for longer. The Halmahera population, and speaking to whether it's invasive, I don't know. I really don't know. As I said, I've never been there. I don't know how different they look. If they're just like a big Borneo or Sumatran reticulated python, then yeah, there's a good chance that they could be introduced. But my understanding is that they are a bit smaller. They do look different. So yeah, and it's, there is obviously Wallace's line, but Retics can swim, man, and they are, they're super common. They were probably traded for food back in the day between those areas. They haven't got across Lindeker's line, so that's the one that separates New Guinea from, say, Wallacea. I really couldn't speak to it. I don't know. I suspect they are natural, and it's just one of those cool, funky things. It's like, how did all those animals get to Biak, an oceanic island that's not connected? They get there on rafts of vegetation. It sounds freaking implausible, right? Like, how does that happen? And how do enough animals get across on rafts of vegetation such that there's, at the same time, such that there's a population that can then breed and start a novel population? It just sounds bizarre, but it happens. But like many of the evolutionary arguments, it's like, did that really happen? And when you think about it, it can, but a lot of coincidences happened, and a lot of luck and just these sorts of things. And so and it's, it's not that far. There's a, Baru and many of these places have big retics. And so, whether it happened a long time ago, because they had a sultanate of Halmahera. People have been on there for ages, trading stuff in between. And so they might have been there for only several thousand years. I think the cool thing is that they occur next to scrub pythons. How good is that? And the question is also, how did the scrub pythons come the other way? So you basically have Halmahera in the middle, and you have scrubs coming this way, and Retics coming the other way.
Yeah.
One has Lindeker's line, the other crosses Wallace's line. And but they're both there. Yeah.
No, I mean, Halmahera is a fascinating place, and those reticulated pythons, they're strange. They're different. They're actually, it's my favorite of the reticulated pythons. But they're most analogous to the ternate animals. They're darker, a little bit smaller, like 10 feet or so for adults. Very, very strange. And so based on what you were saying about how, from a molecular standpoint, within the vast range of reticulated pythons, they're all fairly similar. What do you assume caused that as compared to like scrub pythons or green tree pythons, where there's a greater difference in a smaller range?
I think reticulated pythons are much more generalist species, both in terms of their habitat and dietary requirements. I mean, they're all through Singapore. They're all through like some of the world's largest, most populous cities have thriving populations of scrub pythons. They're in rice paddies. They're in oil palm plantations. They're just super good at adapting to things. And so when, for say, a green python, when a land bridge is connected, it's not sufficient for just the land bridge to connect this place to that place and allow gene flow. You also require the rainforest habitat to be on that land bridge such that they can get across. Those things, they don't always, because during periods of glaciation, when water is trapped in, it's colder and it's trapped in the ice, the sea level drops, but it's much drier. The world's climate is much drier during those periods, so it's less likely that. So yeah, there's a land bridge, but it's less likely that you're going to have rainforest in those areas where it's a bit touch and go in terms of the amount of rainfall, whether there's enough to sustain a rainforest. And so that's why I say a green python is going to be separated for longer. Retics, that doesn't matter. They just cruise through whatever habitat because they're just bosses. And yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons. I mean, I got a call the other day from the government of New Caledonia.
Okay.
Sent a bunch of photographs, and I got our membership and then IUCN onto it. But basically, they called them deer mummies. They're French, right? So they're translating everything, and they were like, we found these deer mummies in the forest, and basically they've got a reticulated python living in a remote part of New Caledonia. So this thing has come around New Guinea from the Solomons, across the Solomons down into New Caledonia, which is in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Right? It's on the eastern side of Australia. And they've got this pretty big reticulated python that's been eating deer and it was like, it's in a remote part. So it's like, did one of the citizens of this place have a pet and then go and release it on the remote part of the island? Or did this animal get there on a raft of vegetation? And what's going to happen? Because obviously the Everglades and Burmese and things, people are terrified about large constrictors, invasive potential. So the government's going nuts. So we're all just, obviously first point of contact is like, oh, look, just go kill it if you want. I don't really care. I don't know. But anyway, because it's clear that they don't occur there. God knows how it got there, but they're not meant to occur there. But then again, however it got there, it's been just doing its thing, living down on a Pacific island, still just crushing deer and all sorts of stuff and living the good life.
Wow, that's incredible.
They're pretty adaptable.
Crazy story. Yeah, that is for damn sure.
And to bring that full circle, that's that adaptability and that ability to disperse and live in different habitats, eat whatever. I've pulled porcupines I've pulled everything out of under the sun out of reticulated python stomachs. They'll eat anything. Beer cans, just and it's for that reason I think that they're more or less one thing across all of those different islands. Because remember, that's Sunderland, it's called, and Sunderland again, that sea level drops. That's all connected. I think a more interesting question is, why do you have Burmese pythons in Indochina, i.e. in, say, mainland Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, those places, not in Sumatra, but you do have them occurring naturally on Java. So you have them here and you have them here, and the big island that comes up here, you'd think they would have come from here down through that island onto this island. They're here and they're here, but they're not in between. So questions like that, it's like, how the hell does that occur?
Wow, I didn't even know that Burmese were on Java. That's crazy.
I'm pretty sure they're on Bali as well. They're on Sumbawa. So I'm pretty sure Bali, the Flores, all of those, you get Burmese.
So then theoretically, Burmese and reticulated pythons are living in the same, do have overlapping habitat.
Well, they do throughout Indochina anyway.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
But yes, also in
those islands,
Java, Indonesia. Yeah. But then again, on Sumatra and Borneo, you only get retics and blood pythons.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I ain't got the faintest. Well, Indochina is a bit drier, and Java is quite dry relative to Sumatra.
Okay.
And typically Burmese like a drier habitat than a reticulated python, but I just don't know, man. I really don't know. It's fascinating. Maybe they were taken there. Maybe they were worshipped back in the day. You don't know what humans, look. Imagine a biogeographer turning up to Miami in 200 years' time and being like, "Oh my God, all these animals from these other places. How did it occur?" It's like, well, they escaped from pet traders or they were released, or people can do some weird things, and I'm sure they were doing weird things several thousand years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
Taking animals from one place to another.
That's true. We got a question. Have there been the hybrids found in the wild, the retics and the Burmese?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Never heard of that.
Okay. Interesting.
Is that what they're called? Are they called bat eaters?
Yes, they're called bat eaters in the trade. It's very. I think it's because like the first ones had like head pattern that looked like the Batman logo, and they're just like bat eater. I think I could be totally wrong on that. So Dalton wants to know if you observe that retics do better around populated areas than Burmese.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
That makes sense.
You do still get lots of Burmese in villages. Like there's quite a lot of human wildlife conflict between Burmese and local people. Like their dogs and their goats and their chickens and things do get smashed by Burmese. But in the larger cities, like concrete jungle type cities, you don't see Burms. Whereas Singapore is filled with, doing radio tracking on them, and they'll live under in the foundations of a car park in the sewer and just come out, eat an animal, and they live on the rats in the sewers. They're just so adaptable. Also, there's the massive trade. There has been it's difficult to know if it's habitat modification or harvesting, or it's probably both, but Burmese have been reduced, their populations in some parts of the world, due to harvesting for the skin trade and for meat trade, whereas reticulated pythons, hundreds of thousands are captured every year. They have been for the last century. So imagine every single year for the last 100 years, they're just getting taken out of the wild. Like I think Indonesia's quota is 175,000 retics every year.
Holy shit.
Yeah, and that the populations are still just as high as ever. And they're all through the cities. They're eating people. I mean, I think 5 or 6, but I get all the Indonesian news from my colleagues in government, and like another woman got eaten the other day by a retic. It seems like South Sulawesi is a fucking hotspot for giant reticulated pythons because people keep getting eaten. I think there's about 6 or 7 people eaten there in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's what the hobby would probably agree with, is that like the Sulawesi retics are what you kind of consider the giants. But it makes me think, like, thank God the Burmese are invasive in Florida and not retics to the same degree. Like if that was retics back in the 80s, we would it would be apocalyptic down there in South Florida. Miami would be a Burm land now, or retic land.
Where are there's the ones on Puerto Rico? Where are they thought to originate from? What part of Indonesia? Because there's wild retics on Puerto Rico.
Yeah, that I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
That'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the tiny island is now overrun by retics by 2040 or whatever. Oh man, oh what a mess. But that's fascinating though. Yeah, reticulated pythons. There's nothing like them. They're fucking insane.
They're incredible animals. They really are incredible. They're a bit less fun because they are quite, like, I have still got a sore thumb from, it was months ago. It was last year sometime. I was being dumb, and it wasn't even that big, but it just got me in the wrong part of the bloody bone. And yeah, they're as you know better than I do, they're not the most docile of critters.
Definitely not. And actually, Lisa, I'm pretty sure this is in reference to Puerto Rico, is that they're morph animals. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Indonesian morph reticulated pythons. That's insane to think that you can just find, because it came up on a recent episode that I did, but I don't remember in the moment. But yeah, that just adds a whole other layer to this. You got wild morph breeding of retics in Puerto Rico.
Totally.
What a time. Oh man. Well, we definitely have, we're, at least for me, burning the midnight oil a little bit. I appreciate all of your time tonight. I guess this morning where you are, probably early afternoon by now. To kind of wrap this up, what do you see as kind of some of the most important things going forward from a scientific standpoint, like with scrub pythons? What would be, in your estimation, like the important research that needs to be done to further our understanding of these snakes?
I guess it is the taxonomic side. Much as I love to hate it, it would be interesting just to clarify it once and for all. I suspect many of the assumptions are just correct, and there's not going to be anything like, oh my God, world break. But yeah, that would be good to know. In terms of their ecology, we can keep asking questions for a very long time, but I have done a lot of that. And so I guess I need to publish it. It would be nice to know more about them and what they're doing in other parts of New Guinea, like on Biak, for example, and places like that. Certainly, they're what sort of elevations they do get to. But these are sort of one-off questions. I couldn't think of any specific or focused study that would be of major interest. I think the next step would be the taxonomic side.
Yeah. And do you think there's any, I mean, there's probably plenty, but are there any islands or any areas that you think would be, rife for the picking, as far as like, this would be an area that we haven't found scrub pythons in historically, that they probably do exist just based on geography, that would be interesting to try to do some work on?
Yeah, I mean, when we have all of these discussions, we more or less neglect Papua New Guinea, right? Lisa mentioned I think it was Lisa, the Bismarcks. They're really interesting things, and lots of different, Nassau Island off the north coast. I think lyre pythons are there, scrub pythons there. There's lots of questions. There's the Louisiadad archipelago. Are they on the Solomons? Probably not. There's no records, but there's I don't know. On the western side, not really. They've been found in most of the places. There'll definitely be. I found green pythons on random little islands that probably don't even have names. Just because there's so many freaking islands.
Yeah,
sure. On the boat. Like one is, I suppose I can say it now. I used to hold it to myself so that it didn't get smashed. But there's a place called Mouse Num, which is off the coast of Yarpen.
Okay.
And there the animals hold their yellow like Kofi owls. And I don't know how now all the traders are going to rush there, I can tell. But
next week,
I don't know. I only saw, they definitely hold it for much, but it's a different type of yellow. It's not washed out yellow. It's like I don't have anything lying around to show you, but it's a darker yellow. And yeah, you get big yellow animals that just retain the red. So they're yellow, and then they have the red juvenile coloration, and they're like 110 centimeters. These things should be changing color around 60 centimeters, right? So they're almost double the size. And I never saw a large one. I assume they turn green, but like there are random little islands like that, and it's a small island, and so I think in these small islands we have probably a small difference in prey base, and the predator guild or the predator assemblage is slightly different, and so some of those selective pressures for color are relaxed a bit, just owing to the relatively small geographic area of the island. You're getting some of this weird stuff going on, and that'll just be one example of many. I suspect if people I always wanted to when I'm super rich and famous one day, not that that's ever going to happen. I'm hoping you guys can make me super famous with these podcasts. Thanks.
We're doing our best.
Really wanted to get a yacht, and just imagine that your yacht, bunch of mates, a bunch of bears, and just sailing around New Guinea, going to every single little island and spending a week at each just herping, and having a big freezer where you just keep all your genetic samples, you've got all your, scientific stuff, and you just herp, and you would find so much cool stuff because there were just so many small islands where you'd find different colored monitor lizards, green python, locality, this with a cool little, dwarf. You would find dwarf scrub. It would just be amazing. So, there's plenty of this stuff out there. And so one day, get a yacht and eventually do that when I'm retired or something.
Well, if there's some very rich Indonesian Papuan reptile enthusiast who's out there listening, I think Dan is a great idea for you to invest in. So,
Exactly.
Know who you are. Do your part. It's time. Oh, man. Well, man, on that note, thank you again for all your time tonight. Where can people learn more about your different organizations, donate? What are all the different resources that all the viewers and listeners could go to for your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Instagram. I don't think I've made a post in a couple of years, but I'll try and do better. I mean, I'm doing cool stuff. As I mentioned, that camp, taking 100 Aboriginal people out and catching saltwater crocodiles. I'll put some of that up on Instagram over the next week or so. But then obviously People for Wildlife. If you want to donate to all this sort of snake work, not that I expect anything, you can do that. It's the host institution for the IUCN specialist group there. So, and that you can see Facebook, it's not snake focused. So if you're a snake aficionado, you're not going to get too much. But there's a couple of things coming out. I won't say it's the one thing I will keep close to my chest, with just some big range extensions for some of the Australian pythons.
Cool.
Where they, I guess one would assume that they could occur there, but some of that will be coming out through People for Wildlife and that. So, stay tuned.
All right. Hell yeah. Well, man, again, thank you so much for all of your time. This has been an incredible episode, just as jam-packed with information as it could be. I'm going to need to go back and listen to this another time or two to even fully, soak it all in. But yeah, I mean, this was great. Thank you so much again for your time.
No, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to chat with you. Your questions were great. So, I hope everyone enjoyed.
Hell yeah. No, they definitely did. Well, I'm going to throw you backstage for a quick second to close out the show. But again, thank you so much, man. This was incredible.
Awesome. Cheers, buddy. See ya.
All right.
See you.
Well, I mean, my brain is kind of fried right now. This was 3 hours of just nonstop information. I would say probably the most engaged night in the live chat. I really appreciate everybody who showed up. This was lots of great questions, lots of great discussion. I loved it all. For me, you can find me on Instagram at Scrub Shepherd. It's right here in the bottom left corner. And then just Stephen Kush on Facebook. If you like this episode, there is a new podcast every night here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, covering lots of different topics. Like I said earlier in the episode, you can go check out the show that Dan did with MJ, Marshall, and Ryan on All in the Tree Tuesday from a few weeks ago, which was pretty cool. And for all of our scrub python fans out there, check out the Somalia group on Facebook. That's the group that I run over there that has lots of great people in it, lots of great engagement, great conversations about these animals that we're so fascinated by. I'm all over the place again, but for the audio people on Spotify, Apple, all of that, subscribe, give us a 5-star review, all that good stuff. But man, what a show. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next week.